By the 5th millennium BCE, long before organized states appeared along the great rivers of Mesopotamia or China, the open landscapes of Eurasia were already crossed by small but enduring circuits of exchange. Archaeological evidence from the Pontic, Caspian steppe to the valleys of the Yellow River indicates that early communities maintained contact through gift networks and seasonal migration. These movements were not yet commerce in the modern sense. They represented reciprocal systems in which prestige goods, raw materials, and technological knowledge circulated between distant ecological zones. Excavations at sites such as Buatai in northern Kazakhstan, dated to around 3500 BCE, reveal the earliest known evidence of horse domestication, bitware on molars and corrals used for containment. This innovation allowed for broader mobility across the steppe corridor stretching from the Ural foothills to the Altai. Increased mobility facilitated the first sustained contact between forest steppe foragers and sedentary agriculturalists further south. Archaeologists have recovered imported copper ornaments and obsidian blades within these early settlements, indicating exchange across several hundred kilometers. Further east, in the oases of Sarazm, modern Tajikistan, dated between 3700 and 2000 BCE, researchers uncovered turquoise, lapis lazuli, and shells originating from Afghanistan and the Iranian plateau. The variety of materials at Sarazm demonstrates the presence of intermediary routes linking highland miners, pastoral herders, and riverine farmers. Analytical studies of metal isotopes suggest that copper from the Zarafshan Valley was traded westward, eventually reaching the Bactrian-Margiana region. The circulation of these commodities illustrates a basic economic principle that would define the Silk Road millennia later. Ecological complementarity encouraged interregional exchange. By the 3rd millennium BCE, metallurgical cultures such as Afanasevo in the Altai and Andronovo in western Siberia had begun to merge steppe mobility with bronze production. Their cemeteries contain weapon types and ornamental styles strikingly similar to those of the early Near East, suggesting contact, direct or indirect, over thousands of kilometers. Radiocarbon sequencing places these interactions contemporaneous with the rise of urban societies in Mesopotamia. Scholars interpret this as evidence that the technological gradient between West Asia and East Asia narrowed through diffuse, multi-stage transmission. One interpretive insight emerging from these data is that Eurasian integration preceded political empires. It was environmental, not imperial. The open grasslands acted as corridors rather than barriers, enabling populations to adapt to ecological diversity through movement. A second insight concerns technological diffusion. Metallurgy, animal domestication, and wheeled transport appear not as isolated inventions, but as cumulative results of contact across steppe, desert, and mountain zones. A third observation is sociological mobility and exchange fostered hierarchical differentiation, as access to exotic materials became a source of prestige within local communities. In northern China, Neolithic cultures such as Yangshao, 5000 to 3000 BCE, and Longshan, 3000 to 1900 BCE, exhibit imported jade and marine shells far from their coastal origins. The Liangzhu culture in the lower Yangtze Basin produced finely carved jade discs and tsong tubes that archaeometric studies trace to quarries in modern Hunan and Liaoning. The distribution of these artifacts over several hundred kilometers indicates an organized exchange system predating dynastic unification. Records are absent, but stratigraphic association confirms that the movement of high-value materials paralleled growing social complexity. Meanwhile, in Western Eurasia, the diffusion of Indo-European languages correlates with similar patterns of mobility and exchange. The steppe communities of the Yamnaya Horizon, 3300 to 2600 BCE, practiced transhumant pastoralism and constructed kurgan burials containing copper ornaments of southern origin. This shared funerary architecture across the steppe belt implies cultural interaction extending towards Central Asia. Though separated by vast distances, the Yamnaya and Afanasevo groups reveal genetic continuity in ancient DNA studies, reinforcing the archaeological picture of sustained east-west contact. Jade and metal were not the only commodities to move. Textiles, though rarely preserved, are inferred from loom weights and spindle whorls found at multiple sites. Early wool production in the Caucasus appears to have spread eastward with pastoral migrations. The exchange of fibers and dyes would later underpin the textile trade that gave the Silk Road its name. Similarly, the transmission of wheeled transport, solid wooden wheels, documented in the Santashta complex around 2100 BCE, provided the logistical basis for long-distance caravans in subsequent eras. The integration of these prehistoric systems can be viewed through the lens of network theory. Nodes represented by oases, valleys, and resource clusters, connected by seasonal routes maintained by herders and traders. The resilience of this network lay in its redundancy. Multiple overlapping paths ensured continuity despite political instability or environmental fluctuation. Isotopic analysis of human remains from the Darim Basin, dated to 1800 BCE, shows mixed dietary signatures combining millet from the east and wheat from the west, direct evidence of Trans-Eurasian contact before formal Silk Road trade. From a technological standpoint, the movement of bronze metallurgy was a decisive factor. Tin, essential for alloying copper, was scarce and required wide-ranging procurement. Sources in Central Asia, particularly in modern Uzbekistan and Afghanistan, supplied both eastward and westward industries. Archaeologists have documented tin-bronze artifacts in early Shang period contexts, circa 1600 BCE, that likely originated from these Western sources. This linkage between distant metallurgical zones exemplifies how resource geography structured interaction long before written history. Culturally, the exchange of motifs and techniques produced hybrid artistic forms. Decorative patterns found on steppe ceramics combine geometric designs of Near Eastern origin with Chinese stylistic conventions. Such cross-fertilization complicates the notion of isolated centers of civilization. Instead, the prehistoric Silk Road functioned as a diffuse field of mutual influence where innovation traveled faster than empire. Another analytical perspective concerns demography and climate. Paleoclimatic reconstructions from lake core sediments in Central Asia indicate alternating wet and dry phases that influence settlement density and migration. During wetter intervals around 3000 BCE, grasslands expanded, permitting greater pastoral mobility and thereby intensifying contact among distant groups. Environmental fluctuation thus acted as both catalyst and constraint in early Eurasian connectivity. Material evidence from the Altai Mountains provides further insight. The Cimiter-Bino phenomenon, circa 2100 to 1900 BCE, is characterized by the sudden appearance of advanced bronze weaponry across a vast territory from the Urals to China. Metallurgical analysis suggests a rapid eastward diffusion of techniques rather than mass migration. Scholars debate whether this represented itinerant metalworkers or exchange of finished goods, but either scenario demonstrates the existence of high-speed transmission across thousands of kilometers. In interpreting these patterns, historians emphasize the cumulative nature of technological and cultural integration. Each stage, horse domestication, will innovation, bronze casting, expanded the spatial scale of communication. Over time, these processes converged to form the infrastructural and social prerequisites for the Silk Road. The emergence of oasis towns, the standardization of caravan animals, and the establishment of mutual trust systems among traders would later formalize what began as small-scale reciprocal networks. By the late 2nd millennium BCE, regional specialization intensified. The Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex, BMAC, became a focal point for trade between Mesopotamia, the Iranian Plateau, and the Indus Valley. Seals, ceramics, and weights found at BMAC sites mirror those from Harappa, confirming structured commercial exchange. Residue analysis on pottery from these regions has identified traces of sesame oil and aromatics, materials valued in both Eastern and Western markets. The continuity of these exchanges foreshadows the later role of Central Asia as intermediary between civilizations. As for China, increasing population densities in the Lus Plateau stimulated demand for materials beyond local capacity. Jade imports and metallurgical inputs arrived from the west through Gansu and the Hashi Corridor, where archaeological layers from the Qijia culture, circa 2200 to 1600 BCE, contain both Central Asian bronze types and indigenous ceramics. These findings imply that the corridor, later a vital section of the Silk Road, was already functioning as a conduit of goods and ideas during the Bronze Age. Collectively, these developments suggest that by 2000 BCE a trans-Eurasian system of exchange was operational, though fragmented and indirect. The absence of centralized political authority did not inhibit its growth. Instead, decentralized networks ensured adaptability. Each region participated according to its comparative advantage: metals from the mountains, livestock from the steppe, silk and jade from the river valleys. Such systemic interdependence formed the economic and cultural substratum upon which later imperial roads would be constructed. By the close of the Bronze Age, the prehistoric routes linking the steppe, desert, and riverine worlds had matured into a continuous though uncoordinated web of interaction. Obsidian from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, and jade from China had all traversed the heart of Eurasia. The mechanisms that enabled this movement, pastoral mobility, resource specialization, and cross-cultural barter, would persist into the historical period. By the beginning of the second millennium BCE, these early circuits had laid the logistical and cultural groundwork for the organized transcontinental networks that would later be known as the Silk Road. By the Bronze Age, the first faint outlines of the Silk Road had already begun to appear in metal and stone. By the early third millennium BCE, the diffusion of metallurgy and urban organization had transformed Eurasia into a constellation of interacting civilizations. Across a vast zone stretching from the Tigris to the Yellow River, independent centers of innovation began to converge economically and technologically. This era marked the transition from isolated regional networks to structured systems of long-distance exchange. Archaeological and textual evidence from Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Central Asia, and early China demonstrates that between 2500 and 1500 BCE, transcontinental trade routes, though fragmented, were already operational. In Mesopotamia, the world's earliest urban economies depended on imports of raw materials unavailable in the alluvial plains. Records from the royal archives of Ebla and Ur mention distant lands rich in metals and gemstones. Among these was Meluhha, widely identified with the Indus Valley civilization. Cylinder seals, standardized weights, and etched carnelian beads found at Sumerian sites match artifacts from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, indicating organized commerce across the Persian Gulf. The presence of Indus-style seals in Mesopotamian administrative centers suggests that traders from South Asia maintained a resident presence in the region. These interactions illustrate an early form of interregional economic specialization. Mesopotamia exported textiles and silver, while importing copper, ivory, and precious stones. Archaeologists have also traced the distribution of lapis lazuli, a deep blue gemstone sourced almost exclusively from the Badakhshan mines of northeastern Afghanistan. Its appearance in royal tombs at Ur, circa 2600 BCE, and in Egyptian contexts of the same period confirms the operation of long-distance trade networks extending across thousands of kilometers. The lapis trade was not simply decorative. It functioned as a geopolitical linkage between zones of production and consumption. Caravans traversed the Iranian plateau, following routes later integrated into the Silk Road. The logistical challenges of transporting such fragile materials encouraged the development of intermediary stations, caravan animals, and rudimentary security arrangements, early prototypes of later transcontinental infrastructure. In Central Asia, the Bactria Margiana Archaeological Complex, BMAC, emerged between 2300 and 1700 BCE as a nexus of trade and cultural fusion. Excavations at Goner, Togolak, and Dashli reveal monumental architecture, standardized weights, and imported artifacts from both the Iranian plateau and the Indus Valley. Analytical studies of ceramics and metalwork show reciprocal exchanges. Tin and lapis from the mountains traded for textiles and grains from settled agricultural zones. The BMAC's location between Mesopotamia to the west and the Darim Basin to the east positioned it as a critical intermediary. This intermediary function anticipates the later pattern of oasis cities such as Samarkand and Merv serving as mediators between empires. One interpretive insight from this evidence is that the Bronze Age trade sphere created a technological and logistical template for later Silk Road systems. The organization of labor, standardization of weights, and emergence of multilingual trade communities reveal a sophisticated awareness of interdependence. A second insight is that material scarcity drove innovation. The absence of tin or copper in certain regions forced states to establish sustained contact with distant suppliers, transforming exchange from opportunistic to institutional. Finally, the geographic continuity of the Iranian and Central Asian corridor demonstrates that environmental constraints, mountain passes, rivers, and oases, defined the routes long before imperial roads were built. The Indus Valley Civilization, circa 2600 to 1900 BCE, was an equally significant participant in this proto-global network. Archaeologists at Lathal, a port settlement on the Gujarat coast, have uncovered dock structures, warehouse facilities, and stamped seals bearing Indus script. Marine residue analysis confirms that goods were shipped across the Arabian Sea to Oman and the Persian Gulf. Omani sites at Ras Al Jins and Ras Al Had have yielded copper ingots and Indus-style ceramics, suggesting reciprocal trade relationships. This maritime dimension, complementing overland routes, illustrates the complexity of early Eurasian exchange. Parallel developments unfolded in China, where the Erlita culture, circa 1900 to 1500 BCE, often associated with the semi-legendary Xia dynasty, introduced bronze metallurgy of remarkable sophistication. The alloy compositions of Erlitou bronzes suggest technical knowledge possibly transmitted from Central Asia. While direct evidence of contact remains debated, the simultaneous emergence of bronze production in China and Western Eurasia implies technological diffusion across intermediary regions. Archaeological surveys in Gansu and Xinjiang have revealed metallurgical sites containing artifacts with both Eastern and Western features. Daggers of Near Eastern form and Chinese-style ceramics coexisting within the same strata. These findings indicate cultural convergence through exchange networks extending across the steppe and desert zones. A decisive factor connecting these regions was the trade in tin, essential for bronze production. Geochemical studies identify primary sources in modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Iran. Tin from these areas reached both Mesopotamia and China, though via complex, multi-stage transit. Tablets from Kanesh, Kultepe, in Anatolia, dated to the early 2nd millennium BCE, record Assyrian merchant colonies managing metal shipments through central Anatolia. While these routes lay west of Central Asia, their existence underscores a broader pattern. Bronze economies depended on trans-regional metal supply chains. The demand for tin thus created durable east-west linkages, the same corridors later used by silk, horses, and spices. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Mesopotamia's commercial reach had extended deep into Central Asia. Textual evidence from the Mari archives mentions trade missions to lands beyond Elam, possibly referring to regions bordering Bactria. Archaeologists have uncovered Mesopotamian cylinder seals and cuneiform tablets in eastern Iran, while in the opposite direction, Central Asian materials appear in Near Eastern temples. These parallel discoveries demonstrate that exchange was not a peripheral activity but a structural feature of Bronze Age state economies. The interdependence of resource zones encouraged diplomacy, migration, and cultural transmission. The cultural implications were substantial. Artistic motifs such as horned deities, solar symbols, and animal combats appear across Mesopotamian, Iranian, and Indus contexts. The diffusion of these iconographic forms suggests a shared symbolic vocabulary transmitted alongside goods. This transmission was not the result of conquest but of sustained interaction. Merchants, craftsmen, and itinerant specialists carrying both tools and ideas. Over time, such interactions produced hybrid forms of material culture, anticipating the cosmopolitanism of later Silk Road cities. In the Iranian plateau, emerging polities like Elam and Sharai Sokhta functioned as intermediaries between Mesopotamia and Central Asia. Excavations at Sharai Sokhta, dated to around 2500 BCE, have produced materials from as far away as the Indus and the Levant. Its urban grid and standardized craft production reflect intensive long-distance trade. Bioarchaeological studies of human remains reveal diverse isotopic signatures, indicating a mixed population, an early example of demographic mobility along transcontinental routes. Another important factor was the development of administrative technology. The use of seals, ledgers, and standardized measures across Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and BMAC represents a shared commercial logic. These mechanisms allowed distant transactions to be recorded and verified, enabling trust among participants separated by geography and language. Such bureaucratic standardization would later be mirrored in the customs systems of the Achaemenid and Han empires. From a systemic viewpoint, the Bronze Age network can be understood as a multi-core world system, characterized by decentralized exchange among interdependent regions. Unlike later empires, which imposed uniform political control, Bronze Age connectivity relied on reciprocity and specialization. Each center contributed unique products, textiles and silver from Mesopotamia, copper and tin from Central Asia, gems and ivory from the Indus, and bronzework and jade from China. The resulting lattice of trade produced both economic stability and vulnerability. Disruptions in one area could reverberate across the continent. Environmental and climatic factors also influenced these dynamics. Paleoclimatic reconstructions suggest that the aridification events around 2200 BCE, sometimes associated with the 4.2 kilo-year event, contributed to the decline of both the Akkadian Empire and the mature Indus civilization. As irrigation systems failed and urban centers contracted, trade routes shifted northward toward the steppe in Central Asia, regions less dependent on riverine agriculture. This migration of exchange pathways underscores the adaptability of Eurasian networks to ecological change, a resilience that would characterize the Silk Road in later centuries. By 1500 BCE, the structural elements of interregional trade were firmly established. Pack animals such as Bactrian camels, domesticated in Central Asia, provided new logistical advantages for arid transport. The spread of chariot technology, evidenced at Santashta and later in Near Eastern armies, further linked distant regions through military and ceremonial exchange. The diffusion of both chariots and composite bows from steppe cultures to the Near East and China represents one of the earliest examples of dual technological transmission across Eurasia. Analytically, this period reveals how technological interdependence fostered cultural convergence. Bronze Age societies did not share a common language or religion, yet their economies were synchronized through the movement of metals, livestock, and artisans. This synchronization foreshadows the Silk Road's later function as a conduit for ideas and innovations beyond material trade. It demonstrates that the foundations of Eurasian globalization were laid not by empire but by necessity, by the universal need for scarce resources and the willingness to traverse difficult terrain to obtain them. By the close of the second millennium BCE, the proto-routes of the Silk Road were well established, though fragmented among multiple civilizations. From Mesopotamia to the Yellow River, the exchange of metals, stones, and technologies had produced an interconnected cultural horizon. Caravan trails across the Iranian plateau and the oases of Bactria linked distant economies, while maritime routes along the Arabian Sea complemented the overland paths. By the dawn of the first millennium BCE, the stage was set for a new epoch. The spread of iron technology, the rise of steppe nomadism, and the formation of expansive empires would soon transform these early pathways into the structured arteries of the classical Silk Road. From the looms of ancient China came a thread that would one day bind continents. Long before silk became a global commodity, it was the guarded secret of a small cluster of riverine communities in what is now northern and eastern China. Archaeological discoveries indicate that by 3000 BCE, the Yangshao and Liangzhu cultures had already developed techniques for silk production or sericulture, from domesticated silkworms, Bombyx mori. These early societies, centered along the middle Yellow River and the lower Yangtze, combined intensive agriculture with highly specialized textile crafts. Silk fragments recovered from Qianshanyang and Himudu sites reveal fine weaving far beyond simple functional cloth. The presence of silk thread in Neolithic burials demonstrates that the material held ritual and social significance long before its economic value was realized. Microscopic and chemical analyses of these early textiles have confirmed their authenticity as silk, produced through degummed fibers spun into delicate threads. The precision of these techniques implies not only technological ingenuity but also organized domestic production. Archaeologists have unearthed spindle whorls, reeling bowls, and cocoon remains bearing evidence of cutting, suggesting intentional rearing rather than wild collection. These findings collectively indicate that China was the first civilization to domesticate the silkworm, a process that required intimate biological understanding and sustained selective breeding. By the Shang dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BCE, silk had become an established symbol of social hierarchy. Tombs at Anyang, the Shang capital, contain traces of woven silk garments and ornamental bands used in ceremonial attire. Bronze inscriptions refer to silk as a valuable commodity, often listed alongside jade and bronze. The discovery of silk remnants in elite burials, frequently in association with bronze vessels and oracle bones, suggests that textile production was directly connected to ritual authority. The Shang court maintained control over specialized workshops, integrating silk manufacture into the broader administrative economy that supplied the royal and priestly classes. During the subsequent Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, the use and meaning of silk expanded in scope. Textual sources such as the Book of Odes, Shijing, and Rites of Zhou, Zhouli, describe silk as a key element of both ritual tribute and political economy. The Zhou state organized a complex system of tribute payments and ceremonial exchanges, in which regional lords presented silk to the royal court as a sign of loyalty. In return, the king distributed silk garments and bolts of cloth as markers of status and favor. These exchanges created a political hierarchy mediated by material culture, a system in which silk was both a commodity and a language of governance. Archaeological evidence corroborates the literary record. In tombs of the Western Zhou period near Xi'an and Luoyang, excavators have recovered silk fabrics of multiple weave types, including plain, twill, and gauze. The technological refinement of these textiles indicates the rise of professionalized workshops attached to aristocratic estates. Silk also began to circulate beyond ceremonial contexts into the broader economy. Excavated bronze tallies and bone inscriptions mention quantities of silk used for tax or exchange, suggesting that it served as a standard of value, analogous to precious metals in the Near East. By the late Zhou period, especially during the spring and autumn, 770 to 476 BCE, and Warring States, 475 to 221 BCE eras, the organization of silk production reached industrial levels. Regional states such as Chu, Qi, and Qin invested in irrigation, mulberry cultivation, and workshop systems that produced silk both for domestic use and interstate diplomacy. Excavations in the Chu region, particularly at Changsha and Jiangling, have yielded textiles of extraordinary complexity, including multicolored embroidery and damask patterns. These artifacts reveal not only technical mastery but also stylistic diversity, reflecting local innovation within a competitive political landscape. One interpretive insight from this development is that China's early state formation and silk production were mutually reinforcing. Control over sericulture required stable agricultural communities, specialized labor, and bureaucratic coordination, precisely the capacities that defined early Chinese polities. A second insight concerns silk's function as a medium of social communication. Its use in ritual, gift exchange, and statecraft transformed it from a utilitarian product into a symbol of civilization and legitimacy. The possession and bestowal of silk expressed both cultural refinement and political hierarchy. Textual evidence from the Confucian corpus further underscores silk's central role. The Analects and Mencius refer to silk clothing as markers of moral propriety and social order, reflecting its embedding in the ideological framework of early Chinese thought. In these texts, the orderly cultivation of mulberry trees and the diligence of weavers symbolized virtue and stability. Silk thus became not only an economic resource but a moral metaphor, an embodiment of harmony between human labor and nature. Archaeological discoveries from the Mawangdui tombs near Changsha, dating to the early Han period but preserving Warring States traditions, provide direct evidence of this cultural continuity. The tomb of Lady Dai, Xian Jue, contained more than 20 types of silk fabrics, including gauze, damask, and embroidered banners. Chemical analysis of the dyes has revealed sophisticated use of mineral and plant pigments, demonstrating advanced knowledge of color fixation and aesthetic design. These artifacts, though dating slightly later, illustrate the culmination of techniques refined over a millennium of experimentation. They also confirm that silk production by this time involved large-scale labor organization, specialized dyeing, and a division of technical expertise, spinning, weaving, and embroidery, each handled by distinct groups of artisans. By the 4th century BCE, Chinese silk had already reached regions far beyond its origin. Excavations at Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains of Siberia have uncovered small fragments of Chinese silk in the frozen tombs of Scythian nobles. Radiocarbon dating places these finds in the same period as the Warring States, centuries before the formal establishment of the Silk Road. Their presence indicates that silk moved through intermediary trade networks across the steppe, exchanged for horses, jade, or furs. This early diffusion demonstrates that the cultural and economic appeal of silk transcended political borders well before Han expansion. Analytically, this pattern reveals the gradual globalization of a luxury product. While its manufacture remained a state-controlled secret, the finished material circulated through indirect trade, transmitted along routes connecting nomadic and settled societies. This system of intermediaries, traders, emissaries, and frontier communities would later form the backbone of the Silk Road economy. The transition from silk as an internal prestige good to a diplomatic instrument began during the late Warring States and accelerated under the Qin 221 to 206 BCE and Han 206 BCE 220 CE dynasties. The unification of China under Qin Shi Huang created the administrative and infrastructural foundation for long-distance control. Roads, canals, and standardized measures facilitated internal distribution, while frontier fortifications brought the northern steppe under surveillance. The subsequent Han rulers inherited this logistical framework and employed silk as a strategic tool of statecraft. Records in the Hanshu Book of Han describe silk as a principal item in tributary diplomacy. The Han court used vast quantities of silk to secure alliances with nomadic confederations such as the Xiongnu, providing annual gifts in exchange for peace along the frontier. This policy, known as Haqin, or peace through kinship, reflects a calculated use of economic goods to stabilize geopolitical relations. The silk sent to the Xiongnu often re-entered circulation through re-export, reaching Central Asian intermediaries and eventually Western markets. In this way, silk became both currency and conduit, mediating the first sustained East-West political economy. Another interpretive insight emerges from this transformation. Silk functioned as a soft power instrument of early Chinese diplomacy. Rather than relying solely on military coercion, the Han state used the material's prestige value to project influence across cultural boundaries. The controlled release of silk into foreign markets allowed China to maintain economic leverage while protecting the secrecy of production. This dual strategy, technological monopoly combined with diplomatic distribution, underpinned Han China's role as the eastern anchor of transcontinental trade. Supporting evidence from Han tombs and archives confirms the magnitude of this silk economy. Excavations at Jiaoxian, Manqing, and Mawangdui have revealed storage facilities containing bolts of plain and patterned silk, often accompanied by tallies recording quantity and destination. These administrative materials show that silk functioned not merely as a luxury, but as a standardized fiscal resource used for salaries, taxation, and official gifts. Inscriptions on wooden slips from Dunhuang and Juyan mention silk payments to frontier garrisons, demonstrating its integration into the military economy. By institutionalizing silk within bureaucratic structures, the Han state achieved both economic efficiency and ideological coherence. The product symbolized civilization, prosperity, and imperial order, values that justified expansion into the Western territories. The establishment of commanderies in Gansu and the Darim Basin, following the missions of Zhang Qian in the 2nd century BCE, extended Chinese presence into Central Asia and set the geographical foundation for the Silk Road. Yet even before Zhang Qian's journey, the mechanisms for such expansion, material surplus, logistical coordination, and diplomatic use of trade goods, had been developed through centuries of sericultural evolution. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the thread first spun in Neolithic villages had become a tool of empire. Silk's journey from domestic craft to instrument of diplomacy encapsulates the technological, economic, and political maturation of early China. As Chinese states expanded westward, silk became more than fabric, it became diplomacy. When Zhang Qian rode westward, he unknowingly opened the arteries of the ancient world. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Han Empire under Emperor Wu r. 141 to 87 BCE had consolidated its hold over the Yellow River Basin and begun to expand into the vast frontier zones of the Eurasian steppe. The empire's greatest challenge lay beyond its northern and western borders. The powerful Xiongnu Confederation, a coalition of nomadic tribes who dominated the steppe corridor from Mongolia to the Darim Basin. For decades, the Han court had maintained an uneasy peace with the Xiongnu through the Heqin policy, offering silk and tribute in exchange for non-aggression. Yet, by the 130s BCE, Emperor Wu sought a more decisive solution. His strategy combined military campaigns with diplomacy, aiming to build alliances that would outflank the nomads. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu appointed a young officer named Zhang Qian as his envoy. His mission was to travel west in search of the Yuezhi, a displaced Indo-European people who had once inhabited the Gansu corridor before being driven into Central Asia by the Xiongnu. The emperor hoped to persuade the Yuezhi to form a military alliance against their former aggressors. Zhang Qian departed from Chang'an with a small retinue, carrying imperial gifts and sealed credentials authorizing him to speak for the Han emperor. Almost immediately, his mission faced peril. Captured by the Xiongnu near the Ordos region, Zhang Qian was held as a prisoner for over a decade. Historical records in the Shurji, records of the Grand Historian, describe his captivity with remarkable detail. He was forced to marry, lived among the nomads, and learned their customs. This period of observation provided him with first-hand knowledge of steppe societies, knowledge that would later prove invaluable to Han policy. Around 128 BCE, Zhang Qian escaped with his retinue and resumed his westward journey, crossing the Ili Valley into Fergana, Diwen, and later continuing to Bactria, Dacia, in present-day Afghanistan. His travels represented the first recorded instance of direct contact between China and the civilizations of Central Asia. The Shurji reports that Zhang Qian encountered urban settlements, markets, and irrigated agriculture in Bactria, which astonished the Han envoys accustomed to frontier pastoralism. He described these cities as prosperous, governed by local kings, and heavily influenced by Hellenistic culture following the conquests of Alexander the Great. Archaeological corroboration from sites like Ai Khanum and Toktai Sanjin supports these accounts, revealing Greco-Bactrian architecture, inscriptions in Greek and Aramaic, and material evidence of long-distance trade. Zhang Qian's reports emphasize two critical observations. First, he learned that the Yuezhi, now settled north of Bactria, had become sedentary and prosperous, no longer interested in a military alliance against the Xiongnu. Second, he identified the Fergana Valley as a region renowned for its superior horses, prized for their endurance and strength. These heavenly horses, Tianma, would later become a strategic obsession for the Han court, symbolizing the link between diplomacy, commerce, and military power. Despite the failure to forge an anti-Xiongnu alliance, Zhang Qian's journey achieved something far more consequential. It mapped the network of polities that connected China to the Mediterranean world. The Shurji lists 36 states west of the Darim Basin, including Kangju, Sogdia, Dacia, Bactria, and Anxi Parthia. For the first time, the Han government possessed systematic intelligence about the geography, resources, and political structures of Central Asia. Zhang Qian's data transformed the imperial worldview from an inward-facing domain to a participant in continental exchange. Upon returning to Chang'an around 126 BCE, after 13 years abroad, Zhang Qian presented his findings to Emperor Wu. His reports prompted an immediate reorientation of Han foreign policy. Rather than continuing the defensive Haqin diplomacy, the emperor authorized an aggressive western expansion. The Han military advanced through the Hashi Corridor, establishing a chain of garrisons and commanderies that secured routes to the Darim Basin. This move both protected China's agricultural frontier and opened the way for controlled interaction with the western regions. In 119 BCE, following Zhang Qian's recommendations, Emperor Wu launched the Fergana campaigns to obtain the famed heavenly horses. The campaigns were led by General Li Guangli, who crossed the Tian Shan Mountains and engaged in protracted warfare with the Diyuan kingdom. According to the Han Shu, Book of Han, the Chinese eventually compelled Fergana to supply several dozen horses annually as tribute, marking the first recorded instance of formalized trade along what would become the Silk Road. These horses were integrated into the Han cavalry, dramatically enhancing its mobility and effectiveness against the Xiongnu. This episode illustrates a key interpretive insight. The Silk Road began as a geopolitical instrument before becoming a commercial one. The initial impetus was not mercantile curiosity but imperial strategy. Trade followed diplomacy and war, institutionalized through treaties and tribute systems that stabilized the corridor from the Gansu frontier to Central Asia. Archaeological and textual sources corroborate the administrative and logistical measures that followed. The Han established relay stations, Yizhan, postal routes, and fortified outposts across Gansu and Xinjiang, enabling the safe passage of envoys and caravans. Bamboo slips recovered from Juyin and Dunhuang record official expenditures on horses, grain, and silk for frontier garrisons, evidence of the bureaucratic infrastructure underpinning early transcontinental exchange. These facilities also facilitated cultural transmission. Merchants, monks, and diplomats could move between civilizations with increasing predictability. Zhang Qian's intelligence further spurred Han engagement with Parthia, Anxi, a major intermediary empire controlling Mesopotamia and Persia. While direct diplomatic exchange between the Han and Parthians remained limited, indirect trade expanded rapidly. Parthia's position astride the Iranian plateau made it a central broker between the Mediterranean and Eastern Asia. Chinese silk began appearing in Parthian and Roman contexts by the 1st century BCE, as confirmed by classical sources such as Pliny the Elder and Strabo, who described the material's exotic allure and its enormous cost. The earliest silk fragments found in Palmyra and Nisa confirm that Han textiles had reached Western markets long before direct Chinese embassies arrived. A second interpretive insight arises here. Information, not goods, was the first currency of the Silk Road. Zhang Qian's journey transmitted geographic and ethnographic knowledge that allowed states to conceptualize one another as parts of a larger system. This intellectual discovery preceded the material exchange of commodities, demonstrating that connectivity often begins with perception before transaction. Following Zhang Qian's return, Emperor Wu dispatched subsequent embassies to Central Asia, formalizing contact with several states. The Han Shu records multiple missions to Fergana, Sogdia, and Kangju, many of which returned with envoys seeking Chinese alliance or trade. These exchanges were facilitated by the security afforded by the new Hashi Corridor commanderies, Wuwei, Zhangye, Jiuquan, and Dunhuang, which served as staging points for expeditions westward. Dunhuang, in particular, became a cultural and logistical hub where Chinese, Central Asian, and later Buddhist influences converged. By the final decades of the 2nd century BCE, the framework of the Silk Road had taken shape. Though not yet a continuous route, the interconnected network of oases, mountain passes, and steppe trails linked the Han capital with the Fergana Valley, Bactria, and eventually Parthia. Chinese silk traveled west through intermediaries, while horses, glass, and gemstones moved east. Each exchange generated not only material wealth but also new diplomatic norms, envoys, emissaries, and treaties that structured international interaction. A third interpretive insight concerns the transformation of the frontier from barrier to bridge. Prior to Zhang Qian's mission, China's western borderlands had been zones of isolation and military tension. The exploration of Central Asia redefined them as channels of opportunity, integrating steppe and oasis economies into a single transcontinental system. This shift laid the institutional foundations for a millennium of Silk Road exchanges. Material evidence of this transformation appears across the Darim Basin. Excavations at Naya, Lulan, and Miran have yielded Chinese lacquerware, coins, and silk, alongside Greco-Bactrian and Parthian artifacts. Carbon dating confirms that these items date to the 1st century BCE, aligning precisely with the period following Zhang Qian's return. These archaeological contexts reveal hybrid cultures, communities that combine Chinese administrative models with Central Asian artistic forms. The Han court also capitalized on the economic potential of these new routes. Tax records and storage tallies from Han garrisons mention silk, salt, and grain shipments directed westward. Silk became the principal export commodity, functioning as both payment and propaganda. Each bolt of cloth symbolized imperial prosperity and technical superiority. As caravans moved outward, they carried not only goods but also ideas, bureaucratic methods, religious practices, and technological innovations that would eventually reshape the entire Eurasian world. By the end of Emperor Wu's reign, the mission that began as a failed alliance had evolved into a system of enduring interconnection. The Han Central Asian network facilitated regular exchanges between distant societies, setting the precedent for later expansions under the Tang and beyond. Zhang Qian's name entered the annals of Chinese history as the pioneer of the western regions, his expedition marking the first deliberate linkage between East Asia and the wider world. The impact of Zhang Qian's mission cannot be overstated. It provided the blueprint for a diplomatic and commercial infrastructure that endured for centuries, transforming geographic knowledge into strategic power. Through his journey, China ceased to be a closed agrarian realm and became a participant in the vast web of Afro-Eurasian connectivity. With China's gates open, the Silk Road entered an era of imperial entanglement. Between two empires, the Parthians built prosperity from passage. By the late 3rd century BCE, the Parthians had emerged from the highlands of northeastern Iran, a region known as Perthava in the Achaemenid world. Initially one among several successor powers that rose after Alexander's conquests, the Parnai tribe under Arsaces I seized control of the Seleucid province of Parthia around 247 BCE. Over the following decades, their dominion expanded westward across Iran, eventually forming a vast state that stretched from Mesopotamia to the borders of Central Asia. The Parthian Empire's geography, nestled between the Mediterranean and the steppes of Inner Asia, made it a natural gatekeeper for trade between the Roman world and Han China. Records from both Greco-Roman and Chinese sources confirm the Parthians' central role in this emerging system of transcontinental exchange. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, complained of Rome's growing dependency on silk, gold, and spices brought through the hands of the Parthians. Meanwhile, the Hanshu Book of Han notes Chinese envoys encountering Parthian merchants who described lands far beyond their western horizon. These testimonies reveal how, long before any direct contact between Rome and China, the Parthians acted as intermediaries, regulating the movement of goods, collecting tariffs, and maintaining diplomatic balance along the overland corridors. The Parthians' prosperity rested on a combination of geographic control and political pragmatism. Their capital at Ctesiphon, near modern-day Baghdad, stood at the junction of several ancient highways linking Mesopotamia to Iran and Central Asia. From here, caravans departed toward Ecbatana, Hecatompylos, and the Caspian Gates, routes that funneled silk, lapis lazuli, spices, glassware, and silverware through Parthian-held territories. Archaeological findings at Nisa, the early Parthian royal city near Ashgabat, have yielded Hellenistic-style wine rhytons, ivory carvings, and Chinese silk fragments, material evidence of an economy nourished by cultural crosscurrents. Parthian rulers understood that commerce thrived best under stability. Their administrative system was notably decentralized, granting autonomy to local satraps while maintaining a network of fortified caravanserais and customs posts. This flexible governance allowed the Parthians to manage a mosaic of ethnic and linguistic groups, Greeks, Persians, Armenians, and nomadic peoples, without overextending their bureaucracy. The result was an empire that valued continuity and control of routes more than territorial conquest. Their foreign policy reflected this same calculus. The Parthians cultivated diplomatic relations with both Eastern and Western powers, leveraging trade as an instrument of statecraft. Roman legions under Crassus famously suffered defeat at Carrhae in 53 BCE, a conflict motivated in part by Rome's desire to dominate the commercial arteries that enriched Parthia. Yet despite recurring warfare, a pragmatic equilibrium eventually emerged. Diplomatic embassies traveled intermittently between Rome and Ctesiphon, facilitating not only exchanges of tribute but also the regulated passage of merchants. Chinese records corroborate this intermediary role. According to the Ho Han Shu, when the Han envoy Ganing reached the Parthian court around 97 CE, he was informed of the distant Decene, Rome, but discouraged from traveling further. The Parthians, aware of their economic advantage as middlemen, preferred to keep both great empires apart. This episode demonstrates a key structural feature of early Silk Road dynamics. No single empire ever controlled the entire route. Instead, a chain of intermediaries, merchants, translators, and rulers, maintained the flow of goods through overlapping spheres of influence. The commodities themselves mirrored this layered system of exchange. Silk, prized for its rarity, moved westward through multiple hands, often traded for gold, glass, and fine textiles. Archaeological discoveries at Palmyra and Dur Europos in Syria have yielded fragments of Chinese silk, some dating to the early centuries CE. Conversely, Roman glassware and Mediterranean coral have been excavated in Central Asian and Parthian contexts, indicating reciprocal movement of luxury goods. The Parthians not only profited from customs duties but also from domestic craftsmanship, adapting imported motifs into their own artistic traditions, as seen in the synthesis of Greek naturalism and Iranian symbolism in their reliefs and metalwork. One interpretive insight lies in how the Parthian model of trade governance anticipated later Silk Road mechanisms. Rather than relying on direct imperial control, the Parthians institutionalized exchange through tribute networks, vassal states, and merchant guilds. This semi-autonomous framework allowed commerce to continue even during military upheavals. In effect, the Silk Road's endurance depended on the same principle that sustained Parthian rule: decentralized stability across vast, diverse regions. A second analytical observation concerns the cultural mediation performed by Parthian elites. As inheritors of both Persian and Hellenistic traditions, they transmitted artistic forms, coinage styles, and religious concepts across Asia. The spread of Zoroastrian imagery, Greek architectural motifs, and later, early Buddhist iconography through their territory illustrates how commerce and culture intertwined. The Silk Road was never merely economic. It was a corridor of translation, adaptation, and synthesis. Numismatic evidence offers further clarity. Parthian coinage, minted in silver and bronze, bore Greek legends long after Greek had ceased to be the spoken language of the region. This persistence reflected the Parthians' pragmatic approach. Greek remained the lingua franca of trade from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, facilitating communication among diverse merchants. The very coins circulating in caravan towns from Antioch to Merv testify to a commercial system that balanced local autonomy with cosmopolitan exchange. Yet the same conditions that enriched Parthia also constrained it. The empire's loose federation of noble houses made it resilient but slow to adapt. As Rome consolidated power in the West and new powers emerged in Central Asia, notably the Kushans, Parthia's dominance as intermediary began to erode. Roman merchants increasingly sought maritime alternatives via the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, bypassing Parthian-controlled overland routes. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century CE navigational manual, lists Indian ports trading directly with Roman Egypt, marking a gradual diversification of global commerce. Still, for nearly 4 centuries, the Parthians remained indispensable. Their empire functioned as the connective tissue of Eurasia, an organized zone where ideas, religions, and goods could move despite political frontiers. Modern archaeological surveys in Iran and Turkmenistan continue to reveal caravan fortresses, storage facilities, and fortified oases that correspond to routes described by classical geographers like Strabo and Isidore of Charax. These findings underscore that the Parthian economy was not merely passive transit but active participation. They were merchants, artisans, and patrons of exchange. By the early 3rd century CE, however, the balance shifted decisively. Internal revolts and the rise of the Sasanian dynasty ended Parthian rule in 224 CE. Yet their institutional legacy endured. The Sasanians inherited the same caravan networks, diplomatic protocols, and frontier fortifications, refining them into a more centralized system. The Silk Road's next phase, one of even greater imperial entanglement, would rest upon the foundations laid by Parthian governance. As Rome's appetite for silk grew, the western end of the route transformed into an imperial marketplace, and the Parthian successors would now face empires far more ambitious in their reach. In the Kushan realm, merchants and monks carried both silk and scripture. By the middle of the 1st century CE, the political landscape of Central Asia was transformed by a new power, the Kushan Empire. Emerging from the Yuezhi Confederation, a nomadic people originally from the Gansu corridor of northwest China, the Kushans migrated westward during the 2nd century BCE following pressure from the Xiongnu. After settling in Bactria, they absorbed the remnants of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom and gradually consolidated authority over a vast territory stretching from the Oxus River to the Gangetic Plains. Under Kujala Kadphises and his successors, especially Kanishk I.C. 127 to 150 CE, the Kushan state became one of the most cosmopolitan and commercially vibrant empires in ancient Eurasia, a true crossroads of civilizations. The Kushans' geography made them indispensable to the Silk Road network. Their domain straddled the key junction between the Iranian Plateau, northern India, and the Darim Basin. Major cities such as Balkh, Taxila, Begram, and Mathura functioned as hubs where goods, ideas, and artisans converged. Archaeological excavations at Begram, ancient Kapisa, have yielded a remarkable collection of Roman glass, Alexandrian bronzes, and Chinese lacquerware, tangible proof of the transcontinental movement of luxury goods. These artifacts indicate not isolated trade but sustained interaction. The Kushan realm acted as both conduit and consumer, transforming imported materials into local artistic and religious expression. One of the most striking features of Kushan civilization was its cultural and ideological syncretism. The empire's coinage provides the clearest evidence of this synthesis. Early issues featured Greek inscriptions and Hellenistic imagery, Zeus, Helios, and Selene, reflecting their Bactrian inheritance. Later coins introduced Iranian deities like Mitra and Nana alongside Indian figures such as Shiva, depicted with his bull Nandi. This deliberate pluralism was not mere eclecticism. It was an assertion of universal kingship. Kanishk's gold coins, inscribed in Bactrian using Greek script, declared him Shaunano Shao Kanishk Kushano, King of Kings, Kanishk the Kushan. Such multilingual and multi-religious symbolism encapsulated the empire's integrative mission, uniting the steppe, Iranian, and Indian worlds within a single political framework. The Kushans also presided over a religious transformation of enduring consequence. Under their patronage, Buddhism underwent a profound geographic and aesthetic expansion. In the Gandhara region, encompassing parts of modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, Greek naturalism merged with Indian spiritual themes to create the first anthropomorphic images of the Buddha. Sculptures from Taxila and Hatta exhibit flowing drapery reminiscent of Greco-Roman statuary, yet they express the serene detachment characteristic of Buddhist ideals. This fusion, known as Gandharan art, exemplifies how the Silk Road functioned not merely as a channel for goods, but as a laboratory of cultural innovation. Inscriptions and relics further confirm the Kushans' active role in institutionalizing Buddhism as an international faith. The Rabatak inscription, discovered in Afghanistan, records that Kanishk supported the translation of Buddhist texts into local languages and sponsored monastic construction across his realm. Chinese pilgrims such as Xuanzang, writing centuries later, described the enduring influence of these foundations. The transmission of Buddhism northward into the Darim Basin and eventually to China, was made possible by this Kushan-sponsored network of monasteries, traders, and translators. From an economic perspective, the Kushans were among the first empires to standardize long-distance commercial exchange across Central and South Asia. Their gold coinage circulated widely and maintained consistent purity, providing a stable medium for trade from Rome to China. Roman writers like Pliny the Elder lamented the empire's drain of gold toward India, yet much of that bullion likely passed through Kushan intermediaries before reaching the Indian subcontinent. The empire's control of key passes, including the Khyber and Bolan, ensured steady revenue through customs levies and protected the merchant caravans that linked the Mediterranean with the East. Archaeological excavations at Begram illustrate the material dimensions of this economic integration. Among the discoveries were amphorae of Roman origin, fragments of Chinese lacquer boxes, and delicate ivory carvings likely made in India. These findings show how the Kushan capital served as a clearinghouse for Silk Road luxury goods, where Roman glass could be exchanged for Chinese silk and Indian spices. The diversity of the Begram hoard underscores the interconnectedness of the 2nd century CE world, a system of exchange so extensive that a single storage room in Afghanistan could contain artifacts from 3 continents. From an interpretive standpoint, the Kushan Empire represents a pivotal moment in Eurasian history, the fusion of steppe mobility with sedentary statecraft. Their rulers mastered both the diplomacy of nomadic confederations and the bureaucratic institutions of agrarian civilizations. This dual heritage allowed them to adapt to diverse environments and populations, from Iranian highlands to Indian plains, without imposing rigid cultural uniformity. In this respect, the Kushan model anticipated later transcontinental empires, such as the Mongols, that would likewise blend cultural diversity with economic coherence. Another analytical insight lies in the Kushans' treatment of religion as a tool of soft power. By endorsing multiple faiths, they facilitated ideological exchange that complemented commercial traffic. Buddhist monks and merchants often traveled together, their shared routes giving rise to caravanserais that doubled as centers of learning and refuge. The result was a durable synthesis, material wealth and spiritual aspiration reinforcing one another along the arteries of trade. In this period, the Silk Road became as much a network of ideas as of commodities. Chinese and Roman sources, though fragmentary, testify to the empire's intermediary role. The Ho Han Shu refers to the Kushans as Guishuang, noting their correspondence with the Eastern Han court and the exchange of gifts including glass, textiles, and slaves. On the western frontier, Roman trade with India, described in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, often passed through Kushan-controlled regions, making them an invisible but essential presence in Mediterranean markets. These interactions underscore the multi-layered structure of Silk Road commerce. Even when distant civilizations never met directly, the Kushans ensured the continuity of contact through regulated intermediacy. The decline of the Kushan Empire in the late 3rd century CE reflected the shifting balance of Eurasian power. Internal fragmentation, Sasanian expansion from the west, and nomadic incursions from the north gradually reduced Kushan authority. Yet their integrative legacy persisted. The routes they secured and the artistic idioms they inspired continued to shape the Buddhist and commercial landscapes of Central Asia for centuries. Gandhern monasteries flourished long after the empire's fall, serving as way stations for pilgrims traveling from India to China and beyond. By binding together regions that had previously existed in isolation, Iran, India, and the Hellenistic East, the Kushans transformed the Silk Road from a series of fragmented exchanges into a coherent transcontinental system. Their empire embodied the first true meeting of worlds, nomadic and urban, Greek and Indian, spiritual and mercantile. The flow of silk, glass, and gold was accompanied by the flow of scriptures, philosophies, and artistic conventions, each reshaping the civilizations they touched. Religion, not just goods, now traveled the ancient highways, as faiths born in India and nurtured in Central Asia began their long journey toward the heart of East Asia. Along the Silk Road, the hum of markets mingled with the chanting of sutras. By the 1st century CE, the Silk Road was no longer only a corridor of commerce. It had become a network of sanctuaries and shrines where merchants and monks alike found both profit and purpose. Across the deserts and mountain passes of Central Asia, Buddhist monasteries emerged as key nodes in the infrastructure of exchange. These institutions served dual functions: spiritual centers devoted to teaching and ritual, and logistical hubs that sustained the movement of caravans, pilgrims, and scholars across thousands of kilometers. From Khotan in the Tarim Basin to Dunhuang on China's frontier and Bamiyan in Afghanistan's mountain valleys, monasteries transformed the Silk Road into a landscape of both trade and transcendence. The earliest of these Buddhist enclaves likely developed under Kushan patronage, but their proliferation across the Tarim Basin during the 2nd to 5th century CE coincided with the rise of stable transcontinental traffic. Monks traveled alongside merchants, and both relied on a shared infrastructure of wells, rest stations, and fortresses. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Naya and Miran reveals that many oases sustained large monastic complexes supported by trade revenues. Documents written in Kharosthi and Gandhari recovered from these sites mention the donation of goods, silk bolts, spices, and silver to monasteries by caravan leaders, indicating the tight economic relationship between religion and commerce. Khotan, situated on the southern rim of the Taklamakan Desert, stands as a prime example of this symbiosis. According to Chinese pilgrim accounts, it was both a thriving Buddhist kingdom and a wealthy entrepot renowned for its jade and silk production. The Book of the Later Han describes Khotan's close contact with the Han Empire, while later travelers like Faxian, early 5th century CE, recorded the presence of many monks and noble patrons. Excavations at the Rawak and Dandenwillik sites have uncovered stucco statues, murals, and inscriptions attesting to an active Buddhist artistic tradition influenced by Indian and Iranian motifs. The city's prosperity derived as much from its spiritual reputation as from its trade in luxury goods, demonstrating how monasteries could anchor entire economies. Farther east, Dunhuang became perhaps the most celebrated monastic and artistic center of the Silk Road. Located at the junction of the Hushi Corridor, Dunhuang marked the gateway between China and Central Asia. From the 4th to the 10th century CE, successive dynasties, from the northern way to the Tang, sponsored the carving of the Mogeo Caves, a monumental complex of grottos filled with murals and manuscripts. These caves, numbering over 700, preserved not only Buddhist iconography but also a record of daily life along the Silk Road. The murals depict caravans, foreign envoys, and ships bearing goods, visual testimony that the spiritual and the commercial coexisted seamlessly. The discovery of the so-called Library Cave, Cave 17, in 1900 revolutionized our understanding of this world, containing over 50,000 manuscripts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and other languages. The cache included merchant contracts, travel permits, and donation records alongside sutras and commentaries. This assemblage shows that monasteries functioned as administrative and cultural archives, where economic documentation and religious literature shared the same shelves. The monks of Dunhuang were not isolated ascetics but educated custodians of a cosmopolitan intellectual network that stretched from India to the Pacific. Bamiyan, located in the heart of the Hindu Kush, formed the western complement to these eastern centers. Its colossal Buddha statues, carved into the cliff faces during the 6th century CE, symbolized both religious devotion and imperial patronage. According to the Xuanzang Memoirs, 7th century CE, the valley housed several thousand monks and numerous temples, supported by both local rulers and caravan taxes. The sculpture's stylistic synthesis, combining Hellenistic drapery, Iranian proportion, and Indian iconography, epitomized the cultural hybridity of Silk Road Buddhism. Archaeological analysis of pigments and plaster layers indicates that artisans from multiple regions contributed to the work, reinforcing the idea that Bamiyan was not a remote shrine but a pan-Eurasian workshop of belief and art. Interpretively, the rise of these monasteries illustrates the deep interdependence between faith and economy along the Silk Road. Monasteries provided travelers with shelter, food, and security. In return, merchants endowed temples with donations and land. This reciprocal relationship created a self-sustaining system in which commerce financed piety, and piety legitimized commerce. The Buddhist ideal of dana, the merit of giving, found material expression in the steady flow of gifts from lay patrons to monastic communities, ensuring that even the remotest oases could support large resident populations. From a geopolitical perspective, these institutions also functioned as instruments of soft power. Local rulers recognized the stabilizing influence of monastic centers and often used them to project legitimacy. In Kutcha, the patronage of monasteries by ruling elites fostered diplomatic goodwill with both the Chinese courts and neighboring Central Asian states. Similarly, the Tang dynasty's support of Dunhuang's monasteries reinforced Chinese influence over frontier territories without the need for permanent garrisons. The religious infrastructure thus doubled as a cultural buffer zone, mediating between empires and nomadic confederations. Chinese pilgrims provided the most detailed accounts of this interconnected world. Faxian, traveling from 399 to 414 CE, described well-maintained routes linking India to the Darim Basin, emphasizing the hospitality of monasteries along the way. 2 centuries later, Xuanzang's epic journey, 629 to 645 CE, documented the same network at its apogee. His Great Tang records on the western regions listed dozens of kingdoms and hundreds of monasteries, each a node in a continuum of faith. These itineraries not only preserved the geography of the Silk Road but also served as ethnographic surveys, recording languages, customs, and artistic styles encountered en route. Materially, the circulation of Buddhist art and manuscripts through these monasteries reshaped visual and intellectual traditions across Asia. Murals from Kizil and Bezeklik in the northern Darim Basin exhibit both Indic narrative structures and Persian color palettes, while manuscripts from Dunhuang reveal the gradual Sinicization of Buddhist doctrine. As sutras were translated from Sanskrit to Chinese, new commentarial traditions emerged, adapting Indian metaphysics to East Asian cosmology. The Silk Road thus served as the medium through which Buddhism evolved from an Indian religion into a transcontinental civilization. Analytically, one may observe that the Buddhist monasteries of the Silk Road represent the first true multinational institution of the ancient world. Their continuity across political borders, linguistic boundaries, and ethnic lines created a shared moral and cultural vocabulary that transcended empire. In contrast to the territorial ambitions of secular states, monastic networks relied on voluntary association and moral authority. Their influence persisted through upheavals, wars, invasions, and dynastic collapse, because they operated on the resilience of belief rather than coercion. By the 7th century CE, the Buddhist road had become a central artery of both commerce and culture. From Bamiyan's cliffside shrines to the Mogeo manuscripts, the evidence portrays a civilization knit together not by armies but by ideas. The chanting of monks and the creak of camel caravans echoed through the same courtyards, illustrating the Silk Road's essential character as a space where the sacred and the material converged. As ideas spread west, political empires arose to protect and profit from them, new powers that recognized that the control of belief could be as valuable as the control of trade. Stone, pigment, and scripture reveal a world knit together by devotion and curiosity. By the early centuries of the Common Era, the spread of Buddhism across Central and East Asia had evolved from a movement of wandering monks into an organized system of translation, pilgrimage, and artistic production. The Silk Road became the connective tissue of this process, allowing not only the transmission of scriptures, but also the cross-fertilization of artistic and intellectual traditions. Across oases, monasteries, and imperial capitals, a vast collaborative enterprise emerged. The rendering of Indian religious texts into Chinese, the adaptation of Hellenistic forms to Buddhist iconography, and the state-sponsored patronage of religious art and scholarship. The roots of this exchange lay in the cosmopolitan fusion first cultivated in Gandhara and Bactria. As discussed earlier, Gandharan artists under the Kushans blended Greek realism with Indian spiritual themes, producing the first anthropomorphic representations of the Buddha around the 1st century CE. These sculptures, characterized by wavy hair, draped robes, and serene, symmetrical faces, departed from earlier aniconic traditions that had depicted the Buddha through symbols such as footprints or the Bodhi tree. Archaeological excavations at Taxila, Hatta, and Jamal Garhai have yielded hundreds of such statues, along with relief panels illustrating scenes from the Jataka tales and the Buddha's life. Their naturalistic proportions and classical perspective demonstrate not only aesthetic innovation but also the deep permeability of cultural frontiers. This artistic synthesis radiated outward through the caravan routes. Copies of Gandharan images, rendered in stucco or clay, appeared in Kutcha, Turfan, and Dunhuang. In each region, local materials and styles altered the original forms. In Kutcha, painters emphasized bright color and rhythmic line. In Dunhuang, Chinese influence introduced more stylized features and vertical compositions. Yet the essential iconography, the seated Buddha, the lotus throne, the haloed bodhisattva, remained remarkably consistent. Such continuity across thousands of kilometers reflects not central coordination but shared devotion and exchange among artisans, monks, and pilgrims. Pilgrimage became a defining institution of this transcontinental Buddhism. Monks from China and Korea traveled westward to the sacred sites of India, seeking original scriptures and authentic teachers. The earliest known example is Faxian, who journeyed from Chang'an to India between 399 and 414 CE, returning with Sanskrit manuscripts and relics. His travelogue, a record of Buddhist kingdoms, provides a meticulous description of monastic life across Central Asia and northern India. He noted the prosperity of cities like Khotan and Taxila, where Buddhist learning flourished alongside thriving trade. 2 centuries later, Xuanzang's journey, 629 to 645 CE, marked the high point of this intellectual migration. Supported by the Tang dynasty, he traveled from China through the Darim Basin to India's Nalanda University, returning with hundreds of texts. His Great Tang records on the western regions detailed the geography, politics, and cultures of more than 100 kingdoms. Xuanzang's return to Chang'an was celebrated as a national event, and the texts he brought back catalyzed one of the greatest translation movements in world history. His work at the Tang Translation Bureau, assisted by Indian and Central Asian scholars, produced accurate Chinese renditions of key Mahayana scriptures such as the Yagakar Bhumi Sastra. The organization of these translation centers reflected an unprecedented collaboration across linguistic and cultural lines. In Chang'an and Luoyang, the imperial capitals, specialized institutions were established under state supervision. Teams of monks, linguists, and scribes worked collectively. Indian or Central Asian monks recited the original Sanskrit texts, bilingual interpreters explained the meaning, and Chinese scholars refined the phrasing for doctrinal precision and literary elegance. The translation process itself became a microcosm of the Silk Road's pluralism, a fusion of intellects from across Eurasia devoted to the transmission of knowledge rather than power. One interpretive insight lies in the nature of this translation enterprise as an act of both cultural adaptation and preservation. Rather than mere linguistic conversion, each rendering involved philosophical negotiation. How to express Indian metaphysics, sunyata, emptiness, karma, bodhi, in a Chinese conceptual framework shaped by Confucian and Taoist traditions. This dialogue transformed both traditions. Buddhism gained Chinese terminologies of morality and governance, while Chinese thought absorbed the Buddhist notions of impermanence and compassion. The outcome was a new syncretic tradition, Chan, Zen, Buddhism, which emerged during the Tang period as a distinctly East Asian form of spiritual practice. Art reinforced this intellectual exchange. The Tang dynasty's imperial sponsorship of Buddhist imagery reached a scale unmatched in earlier centuries. At Longmen and Yungang, monumental cave complexes were carved with thousands of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and celestial guardians. Inscriptions record the involvement of the court, military officials, and merchant guilds as patrons, illustrating how religious art had become both a civic and a commercial enterprise. These caves, adorned with murals depicting processions, donors, and musicians, mirrored the cosmopolitanism of Tang society, one enriched by constant contact with Central Asia through the Silk Road. Material evidence from these sites corroborates the textual record. Pigment analysis of murals at Longmen and Dunhuang reveals imported minerals such as lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and cinnabar from Central Asia, testifying to the movement of artistic resources alongside ideas. Similarly, stylistic influences from Persia and India can be traced in Tang Buddhist sculpture. The subtle curvature of drapery folds, the lotus motifs, and the ornamentation of halos. Such artistic hybridity reflects not imitation but selective appropriation. Chinese artists assimilated foreign motifs into an indigenous visual grammar that emphasized harmony and cosmic order. The Tang state's encouragement of Buddhist scholarship served political ends as well. Imperial patronage of monasteries and translation centers helped consolidate frontier stability, integrating diverse ethnic groups under a shared cultural and religious umbrella. This policy extended China's influence along the western regions while reinforcing its image as the guardian of civilization. The inclusion of foreign monks at the imperial court, from Sogdia, Kutcha, and India, symbolized the universal reach of Tang authority. Thus, the patronage of Buddhist art and translation was both a statement of faith and an instrument of diplomacy. A second interpretive observation concerns the Silk Road's function as a medium of intellectual standardization. The canonical texts translated under Tang supervision were disseminated throughout East Asia, forming the foundation of Buddhist education in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Woodblock printing, developed in China by the 8th century, accelerated this diffusion. The Diamond Sutra of 868 CE, the world's oldest dated printed book, epitomizes this achievement, a tangible product of cross-cultural transmission made possible by the very trade routes that carried silk and spices. In this period, the flow of religious art and text reached a point of mutual reinforcement. Scripture inspired imagery, and imagery drew pilgrims who sustained translation projects through donations. Dunhuang's cave murals, often sponsored by merchants returning from Western expeditions, depicted the very journeys that made their creation possible. In this sense, the Silk Road's artistic and textual traditions formed a self-perpetuating cycle, commerce funding piety, and piety inspiring artistic production that, in turn, legitimized further trade. By the late Tang era, Buddhism had become fully integrated into the Chinese intellectual and aesthetic landscape. The monasteries of Chang'an and Luoyang housed vast libraries, while the imperial translation bureaus served as academic institutions in their own right. The Silk Road had not only connected distant regions but also transformed them, fostering an ecumenical civilization bound together by language, art, and devotion. With cultural exchange flourishing, material wealth soon followed, along the booming arteries of trade that would carry silk, spices, and silver across the expanse of empires. In Tang China, the Silk Road reached its most radiant flowering. Under the Tang dynasty, 618 to 907 CE, the Silk Road achieved its fullest expression as a world system of exchange, not only of goods, but of people, ideas, and aesthetics. From the glittering capital of Chang'an to the ports of the southern seas, the Tang world radiated confidence and curiosity, its roads and harbors alive with merchants, scholars, and envoys from every corner of the known world. The empire stood at the crossroads of continents, drawing wealth and influence from the trade arteries that it so carefully protected and taxed. At the heart of this cosmopolitan empire lay Chang'an, a city of nearly 2 million inhabitants, designed as a microcosm of imperial order. With its rectilinear avenues, walled wards, and palatial compounds, Chang'an was not only the seat of the Son of Heaven, but also the beating heart of the Silk Road's terrestrial network. Contemporary sources, notably the Old Book of Tang and the writings of Arab geographers, describe its vibrant diversity. Sogdian traders from Samarkand running silk emporia, Persian jewelers working gold and silver, Buddhist monks from India and Central Asia teaching at monasteries, and Nestorian Christians establishing churches within the city. The Western market, Shishir, of Chang'an was the hub of this global trade. Here, caravans unloaded their treasures: silks, aromatic woods, spices, glass, gems, ivory, and horses. The Tang state maintained strict oversight through a system of tariffs and permits, ensuring both regulation and profit. Silk itself remained the empire's most coveted commodity, but by this era, it had become not only an export but a fiscal instrument. Wages, rewards, and taxes were often paid in bolts of silk, a medium of wealth recognized from the Mediterranean to Japan. Excavations at the Astana tombs near Turfan vividly attest to the material culture of this age. Murals depict officials in richly woven garments, dancers performing Central Asian routines, and banquet scenes filled with imported glassware and silver dishes. Textiles recovered from these tombs, often silk embroidered with Sogdian motifs or dyed with Persian techniques, reflect the intricate layering of influences. The iconography of grapevines, winged horses, and pearl roundels points to a cultural dialogue between China and the Iranian plateau, a visual record of the Silk Road's syncretism. Beyond the land routes, the Tang period also witnessed the emergence of maritime silk roads, expanding the empire's reach southward and westward. The port city of Guangzhou, Canton, became a second cosmopolitan center, where Arab, Persian, Malay, and Tamil merchants conducted seaborne trade. Historical records such as the New Tang Annals mention foreign merchant guilds granted official residence and religious freedom, evidence of institutionalized multiculturalism. Archaeological discoveries reinforce these accounts. The Belitung shipwreck, a 9th-century Arab dhow discovered off Indonesia, carried a vast cargo of Changsha ceramics, Tang gold and silver ware, and Chinese coins, proof of an intense maritime commerce linking the Tang coast with the Abbasid Caliphate and beyond. These seaborne routes complemented the overland networks, creating a double-lattice system of exchange that connected East Asia with Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Within the empire, the Tang government nurtured this global economy through infrastructure and diplomacy. Roads and postal stations stretched west toward Dunhuang and beyond, fortified by military colonies that safeguarded caravans. The court dispatched embassies to Sogdia, Persia, and even Byzantium, cultivating relationships that balanced trade with political legitimacy. One of the most important instruments of control was the silk tax, levied on both domestic production and foreign merchants, which funded garrisons and state projects. The flow of silk thus underwrote not only commerce but empire itself. In cultural terms, the Tang capital became a laboratory of syncretism. The city's temples, markets, and taverns echoed with a dozen tongues: Chinese, Sogdian, Persian, Arabic, and Turkic. Cuisine blended Central Asian dairy with Chinese grains. Music introduced lutes and harps of Iranian origin. Fashion absorbed foreign styles, as Tang nobles favored high boots, short jackets, and patterned textiles once seen only in Samarkand. Court entertainment featured dancers and musicians from Kutcha and Bactria, whose movements and rhythms redefined Chinese aesthetics. Religion flourished under this atmosphere of tolerance. Buddhism remained preeminent, but Taoism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Christianity all found adherents within Tang cities. The Nestorian stele, erected in Chang'an in 781 CE, records 150 years of Christian activity in China, written in both Chinese and Syriac. Similarly, Zoroastrian fire temples and Manichaean shrines have been unearthed in the western regions, revealing the remarkable pluralism of Tang religious life. Diplomatic and economic exchanges also flowed westward. Chinese silk appeared in the courts of the Abbasids and Byzantines, while glass, silver, and aromatics from the Middle East reached China. Numismatic finds, such as Abbasid dinars discovered in China and Tang coins found in Samarkand, provide tangible evidence of mutual circulation. In effect, the Tang dynasty presided over a globalized economy, one that prefigured later transcontinental systems by a millennium. Yet this prosperity was not without its tensions. The wealth of the Silk Road attracted the ambitions of steppe confederations and neighboring powers. To secure its borders, the Tang court stationed armies along the western regions, Xiyu, extending imperial control as far as modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The protectorate system, with Anshi as its administrative center, symbolized the Tang's reach into Central Asia, but also its vulnerability. Garrisons depended on the steady flow of tribute and trade. Disruption in these networks could unravel the delicate balance between profit and protection. From an interpretive standpoint, the Tang era's cosmopolitanism illustrates the Silk Road's evolution from a network of traders into a civilizational ecosystem. Goods no longer merely passed through intermediaries. They were absorbed, reinterpreted, and reborn in new cultural contexts. A glass bowl from Syria might inspire a Chinese craftsman to experiment with glaze. A Persian melody might reshape Tang court music. An Indian sutra might acquire Chinese philosophical nuance. The Silk Road had become not a route, but a rhythm, a continuous circulation of meaning. This synthesis was reflected in Tang art and literature. Poets such as Li Bai and Wang Wei drew imagery from distant landscapes, describing western horses, desert moons, and caravans under foreign stars. Painters depicted Central Asian envoys and exotic animals in court processions, celebrating the empire's role as the axis of the world. Even the imperial tombs of the Tang elite, adorned with stone reliefs of foreigners bearing tribute, symbolized a vision of China not as isolated, but as interconnected, radiant at the center of a global web. By the mid-8th century, the Tang world represented the Silk Road at its zenith, economically, artistically, and ideologically. From the sands of Dunhuang to the docks of Guangzhou, the empire stood as the living embodiment of transcontinental exchange, its prosperity shimmering like silk under the desert sun. Yet, prosperity bred rivalry, and the western steppes stirred once more, as new powers emerged to challenge the Tang's fragile balance between commerce and control. At Talas, ink and empire collided, and the Silk Road changed forever. By the middle of the 8th century CE, the vast network that had defined Tang China's golden age began to show signs of strain. Political, military, and economic pressures converged from multiple directions, from the rising power of Tibet in the west, to the expansion of the Abbasid Caliphate across Central Asia, and from within as rebellion and fiscal exhaustion weakened the Tang state. The Silk Road, once the shimmering artery of global exchange, entered a period of fragmentation and reconfiguration. The first great external challenge came from the Tibetan Empire, whose territorial ambitions during the reigns of Songtsen Gampo, r. 618 to 650 CE, and Trisong Detsen, r. 755 to 797 CE, reshaped the balance of power in Inner Asia. Once a collection of highland tribes, Tibet's unification and militarization allowed it to project influence deep into the Darim Basin, seizing key Silk Road oases, such as Khotan and Dunhuang. Inscriptions and Tibetan administrative documents recovered from Dunhuang caves show the imposition of Tibetan script and governance, replacing Tang bureaucratic systems in the mid-8th century. The Tibetan strategic control of the western corridors effectively severed China's access to Central Asian markets and undermined Tang authority in the frontier protectorates. Simultaneously, the Abbasid Caliphate, established in 750 CE after the fall of the Umayyads, consolidated a new power structure stretching from North Africa to Transoxiana. The Abbasids inherited both the wealth and the geopolitical interests of their predecessors, turning their attention eastward to the rich trade zones of Sogdia and Bactria. The Tang and Abbasid worlds, both heirs to expansive imperial traditions, now faced each other across Central Asia, linked by commerce yet divided by ambition. The confrontation came to a head at the Battle of Talas in 751 CE. Chinese forces under General Gao Xianji, composed of Tang regulars and allied troops from Fergana, advanced into the Fergana Valley to assert control over regional trade. There they encountered Abbasid armies supported by Karluk Turkic auxiliaries. The ensuing battle, fought near the Talas River, in modern Kyrgyzstan, ended in a decisive Chinese defeat when the Karluks defected to the Abbasids mid-engagement. Contemporary Chinese chronicles such as the Tang Annals and Arabic sources including Al-Tabari's histories both attest to the scale of the engagement, which marked a turning point in Eurasian geopolitics. Although not catastrophic in immediate military terms, the Battle of Talas had enduring consequences. It represented the outer limit of Chinese westward expansion and the effective withdrawal of Tang authority from Central Asia. The protectorates of Anxi and Baiting, deprived of imperial support, soon fell under Tibetan and Turkic domination. The political vacuum allowed the Abbasids to secure their control over Transoxiana and integrate the region's trade into the broader Islamic economy. One of the most significant, though often overstated, outcomes of Talas was the transfer of papermaking technology from China to the Islamic world. Chinese artisans captured in the battle are believed to have introduced the techniques of pulp preparation and sheet pressing to Samarkand, from where the knowledge diffused westward. By the 9th century, paper mills flourished in Baghdad, transforming administrative and scholarly life across the Abbasid realm. While the spread of papermaking was likely gradual and multi-sourced, Talas became a symbol of technological diffusion through conflict, a reminder that even in warfare, the Silk Road transmitted innovation. Internally, the Tang dynasty faced concurrent crises that compounded its external setbacks. The Inlushan Rebellion, 755 to 763 CE, erupting just years after Talas, devastated the empire's heartland. The rebellion disrupted taxation, conscription, and governance. Cities like Chang'an and Luoyang were sacked, and millions perished. As imperial control faltered, resources once devoted to maintaining garrisons in the western regions were redirected to restoring domestic stability. The great land and tax reforms that followed fundamentally altered China's economy, weakening the state's capacity to project power westward. As Chinese authority receded, the Silk Road did not vanish but rather reoriented. The Abbasid Caliphate emerged as the central hub of transcontinental exchange, with Baghdad, Nishapur, and Samarkand serving as key commercial nodes. From these cities, merchants known as Sogdians, Persians, and later Arab traders extended networks deep into the steppe and eastward into Chinese territories. Archaeological finds of Arabic coins in Xinjiang and Chinese silk fragments in Abbasid-era tombs attest to the continued, if decentralized, flow of trade. The decline of direct Tang involvement also allowed regional powers to assert independence. In the Darim Basin, city-states such as Khotan and Turfan functioned as semi-autonomous trade centers, balancing allegiance between Tibet, Tang China, and later Uyghur rulers. In the north, the Uyghur Khaganate, 744 to 840 CE, filled the void left by Tang retreat, securing the Orkhon Valley and controlling caravan routes through Mongolia and the Gansu corridor. The Uyghurs, culturally Turkic yet deeply engaged with Chinese and Sogdian commerce, played a crucial intermediary role in sustaining Silk Road operations. From an economic perspective, the contraction of Chinese oversight led to a diversification of routes. Maritime pathways through the South China Sea and Indian Ocean gained prominence, connecting Guangzhou with Srivijaya, the Tamil coast, and the Persian Gulf. These seaborne routes compensated for the instability of the overland roads, marking the beginning of a long-term shift from continental to maritime silk roads. Evidence from shipwrecks such as Belitung and textual accounts like the Chufanqi, by Zhao Ruqua, 13th century, summarizing earlier practices, indicate that long-distance maritime trade was already flourishing under new Islamic and Southeast Asian intermediaries. Culturally, the contraction of the Silk Road's overland network did not halt intellectual or artistic exchange. Instead, it localized them. The oasis cities of Central Asia became centers of manuscript production, Buddhist preservation, and cultural hybridization under mixed rule. The Dunhuang Caves, rediscovered in the early 20th century, contain thousands of manuscripts and paintings dating from this transitional era, some in Chinese, others in Tibetan, Khotanese, and Sogdian, illustrating how religious and cultural continuity persisted despite imperial decline. Interpretively, the events of the mid-8th century reveal the fragility of global systems dependent on imperial stability. The Silk Road thrived not merely through geography but through the coordinated security and fiscal structures provided by large states. When those structures faltered, trade did not end but adapted, rerouted through new powers, technologies, and economic centers. The Tang-Abbasid-Tibetan interplay thus represents both a geopolitical fracture and an example of systemic resilience. By the close of the 8th century, the map of Eurasia had been redrawn. The Tang dynasty, still magnificent within China proper, no longer commanded the vast frontiers it once did. The Abbasid Caliphate stood ascendant, its capital Baghdad the intellectual heart of the Old World, while Tibet and the Uyghurs divided the Central Asian steppes between them. The Silk Road, in turn, became a multipolar network, less a highway of empire than a constellation of overlapping cultural spheres. With Tang power retreating, the road fragmented, but did not fade. In its place arose new intermediaries, local dynasties, and maritime routes, ensuring that the exchange of goods and ideas endured even amid imperial decline. The rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE marked a decisive new phase in the history of the Silk Road. Centered first in Kufa and later in Baghdad, the Abbasid Empire inherited not only the territorial expanse of its Umayyad predecessors, but also the intellectual and economic energies of an increasingly interconnected Eurasia. Within a century of its founding, the Abbasid realm had become the largest integrated economy in the medieval world, linking the Atlantic coast of North Africa with the river valleys of Central Asia and the ports of China. The overland Silk Roads, though fragmented politically, found new life under the Abbasid system of commerce, finance, and urbanization. At the core of this transformation stood Baghdad, founded in 762 CE by Caliph al-Mansur on the banks of the Tigris. The city's circular design symbolized both cosmic harmony and administrative precision, serving as the nexus of imperial governance and long-distance trade. Byzantine silks, Chinese ceramics, Indian spices, and African ivory circulated through its vast markets, while caravans from Samarkand, Merv, and Nishapur brought goods across the Iranian plateau. Contemporary sources such as Al-Yaqubi and Ibn Khordadbeh describe Baghdad as the meeting place of merchants from the ends of the earth. Archaeological layers reveal imported wares, Tang porcelain, glass from Syria, and carved ivory from East Africa, attesting to the truly global scale of Abbasid commerce. This era witnessed what historians often term the Abbasid commercial revolution, a structural transformation in the organization of trade and finance. Merchants developed sophisticated systems of credit, partnership, and banking, enabling large-scale transactions across thousands of kilometers. The Suftaja, bill of exchange, and Hawala, transfer order, allowed capital to move without physical transport of coin, reducing risk and increasing liquidity. These mechanisms, recorded in Arabic legal manuals and merchant letters, represent the earliest prototypes of modern banking instruments. Along the land routes, the Abbasid state and private patrons sponsored an expansive network of caravanserais, fortified roadside inns that provided security, storage, and logistical support. Located roughly a day's journey apart, they dotted the routes from Ray to Bokhara, ensuring safe passage for traders and pilgrims alike. Excavations at Ribad-i-Malik in Uzbekistan and Caravanserai of Deir al-Akal near Baghdad reveal standardized layouts with courtyards, stables, and prayer rooms, architectural evidence of an institutionalized trade infrastructure. The road itself became not merely a path of travel but an organized economic corridor sustained by taxation, endowments, waqf, and local governance. Key to the Abbasid system were the Sogdian and Persian merchant communities, heirs to centuries of Central Asian commerce. Long before Islam's arrival, Sogdians from Samarkand and Bokhara had served as intermediaries between China and the West. Under Abbasid rule, many converted to Islam and integrated into the expanding Persian-speaking world, bringing with them the expertise, language, and networks essential for maintaining the Silk Road's continuity. Documents from the Mount Mug archive in Tajikistan, written in Sogdian and dating from the 8th century, show contracts, debts, and partnership agreements identical in function to Arabic commercial instruments of later decades. Samarkand emerged as the critical junction between the Islamic and Chinese worlds. Strategically positioned along the Zarafshan River, the city thrived under Abbasid suzerainty as both a manufacturing center and a cultural hub. Archaeological excavations have revealed evidence of silk workshops, ceramic kilns, and paper mills, the latter possibly deriving from the paper-making techniques transmitted after the Battle of Talas. By the 9th century, Samarkand's paper had become a staple export across the Islamic world, replacing costly parchment and enabling the explosive growth of Arabic scholarship. The city's mosques and madrasas, adorned with imported Chinese motifs and Persian calligraphy, embodied the aesthetic synthesis of the Silk Road. The integration of textiles remained the economic foundation of this system. Abbasid-era weavers adapted techniques from both East and West, silk embroidery from China, wool weaving from Persia, and dyeing methods from India. Cities such as Nishapur, Wazit, and Basra became centers of textile production, exporting brocades and patterned silks to Byzantium and beyond. Fragments of Abbasid silks preserved in European cathedrals, including those in Aachen and Sens, testify to their immense prestige. Trade in silk was both economic and symbolic. It signified the Abbasid claim to universal authority, linking them ideologically to the grandeur once monopolized by the Tang and Roman empires. The Abbasid era also witnessed a boom in maritime commerce complementing the overland routes. Muslim sailors from Basra and Sirif established sea lanes across the Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean, connecting the Persian Gulf to ports such as Calicut, Srivijaya, and Guangzhou. The 9th century Akbar al-Sin Waralhind, Accounts of China and India, describes Chinese markets filled with Muslim merchants and ships laden with gold, dates, and glassware. The simultaneous flourishing of maritime and terrestrial routes produced a dual network system that effectively globalized the Silk Road economy under Islamic auspices. Intellectually, the wealth generated by this commercial expansion funded one of the most profound cultural movements in history, the translation and scientific revolutions of the Abbasid Golden Age. Revenues from silk and spice taxes financed the Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom, in Baghdad, where Greek, Persian, and Indian texts were translated into Arabic. Paper and import from the East accelerated this process by democratizing literacy and record-keeping. The same caravans that carried silks and spices also transported manuscripts, scholars, and instruments, embedding the Silk Road within the infrastructure of knowledge itself. Interpretively, the Abbasid commercial revolution demonstrates how the Silk Road evolved beyond geography into a system of economic interdependence. Unlike earlier imperial models that relied on direct control, the Abbasids cultivated stability through institutions, currency uniformity, legal standardization, and infrastructural patronage. Trade was regulated not by armies but by contracts and trust networks. The resulting prosperity bound distant regions into a single economic continuum without the need for continuous conquest. By the 10th century, the Abbasid world had reached a high degree of integration. Gold dinars minted in Baghdad circulated in West Africa, while Chinese ceramics appeared in Egyptian archaeological layers. Samarkand's paper and Nishapur's textiles were found in Cairo's Geniza archives. Conversely, Abbasid coins and glassware reached as far as Japan. These patterns illustrate not isolated exchanges but systemic, enduring connectivity. The Silk Road functioning as a global economic bloodstream, sustained by Islamic finance, Persian craft, and Central Asian mobility. However, this prosperity also sowed the seeds of decentralization. As the Abbasid caliph's political control waned in the late 9th century, regional dynasties such as the Samanids, Buyids, and Saffarids emerged, each commanding segments of the trade routes. Yet the system endured, driven by its internal momentum. The Silk Road had become self-sustaining, its caravans propelled not by imperial decree but by the logic of commerce itself. As Islamic networks strengthened and diversified, power on the steppe shifted once again. Turkic confederations began to dominate the northern corridors, forging new empires that would inherit and reshape the Silk Road's legacy. From the markets of Bokhara to the deserts of Khotan, a new world was taking shape. By the 9th century CE, the Islamic world had stabilized after a century of expansion. In Central Asia, the Abbasid Caliphate's influence gave rise to regional powers that blended Persian, Turkic, and Islamic traditions. Among these, the Samanid dynasty, 819 to 999 CE, stood out as both heirs to Persian culture and intermediaries in the Silk Road's vast commercial system. Their dominion over Transoxiana and Khorasan, with capitals at Bokhara and Samarkand, transformed the region into a vibrant zone of urban, intellectual, and mercantile activity. Archaeological layers from Afrosiab and Penjikent showed dense habitation and craft specialization, testifying to a society rebuilt around trade and literacy. The The Samanids' administration reinvigorated pre-Islamic patterns of governance by combining Persian bureaucratic traditions with Islamic law. Records preserved in Arabic and Persian chronicles describe extensive tax collection from caravans and standardized coinage minted in silver dirhams bearing Arabic inscriptions alongside local symbols. These dirhams have been found as far afield as Scandinavia, particularly in Gotland and Burka, evidence of long-distance exchange routes linking Central Asia with Northern Europe. The circulation of Samanid silver thus represents one of the earliest globalized monetary systems, connecting Muslim merchants, Viking traders, and steppe intermediaries through shared commercial logic. Intellectually, the Samanid court presided over a Persian cultural renaissance. Writers such as Radaki and Dakiki flourished under their patronage, setting the stage for the later Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, completed after the dynasty's fall but rooted in its revivalist ethos. This literary movement was not merely aesthetic. It represented a reintegration of Iranian heritage into the Islamic world. According to later historians like al-Biruni, the Samanid era restored a sense of Persian linguistic and scientific authority that had been obscured under early Arab dominance. This synthesis of Arabic scholarship and Persian expression would shape the broader intellectual geography of the Silk Road, influencing centers from Baghdad to Kashgar. Trade during the Samanid period followed both overland and riverine networks. Caravans traversed the Oxus River basin, carrying silk, spices, furs, and ceramics between China, India, and the Mediterranean. Archaeologists at Merv and Nishapur have unearthed fragments of Chinese porcelain, Indian beads, and glassware from Syria and Egypt, illustrating a dynamic system of exchange mediated through local bazaars and caravanserais. The state's protection of merchants, through guarded way stations and predictable taxation, encouraged stable movement across the arid zones of Central Asia. As one geographer, Ibn Aqil, observed, "The cities of Khorasan are rich with merchants, for all goods of the world pass through their gates." By the 10th century, Turkic tribes from the Oghuz and Karluk confederations began to play a decisive role in this commercial ecosystem. Initially nomadic auxiliaries and mercenaries, their gradual sedentarization along trade corridors introduced new patterns of power. The Karakhanid dynasty, emerging in the late 10th century, converted to Islam and absorbed much of the Samanid realm. This transition from Iranian to Turkic leadership marked not a rupture but a continuation. The Silk Road's vitality persisted through adaptive governance. Inscriptions and architecture from Balasagun and Kashgar show Persian Islamic influence embedded within Turkic cultural forms, an early signal of the hybrid civilizations that would define medieval Eurasia. The Seljuks, rising in the 11th century from the same Turkic steppe milieu, expanded this integration on a larger imperial scale. Their migration from the Sir-Daria region into Iran and Anatolia redrew the map of Eurasian politics. Sources such as al-Kunduri's administrative records and the chronicles of al-Bayhaqi describe how the Seljuks organized caravan routes through a hierarchy of protected passes and fortified outposts. Their empire stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Mediterranean, ensuring the safe transit of merchants, envoys, and pilgrims. This network of control effectively reconnected the fragmented segments of the Silk Road after the political decline of the Tang and Abbasid centers. The Seljuk administration's economic policies illustrate how steppe traditions adapted to sedentary empires. They encouraged the founding of caravanserais, walled hostels offering lodging, security, and water to travelers, along the major roads between Ray, Nishapur, and Herat. Excavations at sites like Ribad-i Malik in Uzbekistan confirm state-sponsored infrastructure designed explicitly to sustain transcontinental trade. Simultaneously, the Seljuks fostered agricultural expansion and urban rebuilding, aligning pastoral and agrarian economies within one imperial system. This duality, mobility combined with permanence, was essential to the Silk Road's resilience. Cultural synthesis under the Seljuks extended beyond administration. The diffusion of Persian literature, Arabic theology, and Turkic military ethos created a cosmopolitan elite fluent in multiple traditions. Architectural evidence, particularly the Karakan Towers and Isfahan's Friday Mosque, displays the fusion of geometric design and calligraphic ornamentation emblematic of the era's aesthetics. The Silk Road at this stage carried not only goods but also architectural templates, religious motifs, and philosophical discourse. According to the historian al-Nasawi, Seljuk courts in Nishapur and Isfahan hosted scholars who discussed Greek philosophy alongside Quranic commentary, symbolizing the intellectual pluralism supported by trade wealth. Economic expansion also facilitated the spread of religious and linguistic institutions. The Seljuks' patronage of madrasas, such as the Nizamiya schools established by the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, institutionalized Sunni scholarship across the empire. These schools functioned along the same routes as commercial caravans, creating overlapping geographies of commerce and education. The circulation of books, scribes, and teachers paralleled that of textiles and spices. This alignment between intellectual and material exchange would profoundly shape the Islamic world's cultural unity from Central Asia to the Levant. In Central Asia, the legacy of both Samanids and Seljuks converged in the emergence of urban Islamic civilization. Cities like Bokhara, Merv, and Herat became enduring centers of learning, art, and trade. Excavations in these cities have revealed glazed ceramics bearing both Arabic inscriptions and Chinese-inspired motifs, a tangible reflection of the intercontinental synthesis achieved along the Silk Road. Coins, manuscripts, and textiles from this period demonstrate a continuity of economic sophistication and cultural dialogue, even amid shifting political frontiers. By the close of the 11th century, the commercial geography of Eurasia had been permanently reconfigured. The Turkic dynasties of Central Asia stabilized long-distance exchange, while Persian culture and Islamic scholarship remained the lingua franca of administration and trade. The steppe Renaissance, driven by mobility, religious patronage, and multilingual literacy, had transformed the Silk Road into a structured, interconnected world economy. Yet even as commerce thrived, new conquerors loomed on the horizon, and the steppe would once again unleash forces that reshaped the Silk Road under Mongol dominion. For a brief century, one empire made all roads safe. The 13th century CE marked a watershed moment for the Silk Road, as the Mongol conquests under Genghis Khan, r. 1206 to 1227, unified vast tracts of Eurasia under a single mobile authority. From the steppes of Mongolia to the frontiers of the Middle East, the Mongols established an empire unparalleled in scale, reshaping political, economic, and cultural networks. This unification enabled a level of transcontinental exchange previously impossible. Caravans moved with unprecedented security, merchants navigated coherent legal frameworks, and ideas traversed continents alongside goods. The era known as the Pax Mongolica transformed the Silk Road from a series of fragmented routes into a contiguous global system of trade and communication. Central to this system was the creation of Karakorum, the Mongol capital, which functioned as a hub for both administration and exchange. Archaeological excavations reveal a city of impressive cosmopolitanism, with Chinese artisans, Persian scholars, and Central Asian merchants living and working side by side. Contemporary travelers, including William of Rubruck and Ibn Battuta, recorded the diversity of Karakorum, noting the presence of Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim communities under Mongol protection. This confluence of cultures illustrates how imperial policy facilitated not just security, but the active circulation of knowledge, craftsmanship, and religious practice. The Mongols' administrative innovations further reinforced the Silk Road's efficiency. The Yam postal system, a network of relay stations with mounted couriers, allowed messages, intelligence, and official decrees to travel across thousands of kilometers in weeks rather than months. Merchants could rely on these stations for lodging and supplies, creating logistical certainty along routes that had previously been unpredictable. In addition, Mongol rulers maintained diplomatic correspondence with Europe, the Islamic world, and China, sending envoys such as Guillaume de Rubruck and receiving delegations from the papacy, Byzantium, and the Abbasid Caliphate. These exchanges formalized connections between the East and West, setting the stage for unprecedented commercial and cultural integration. Trade under Mongol rule expanded in both volume and variety. Chinese silks, ceramics, and paper flowed westward, while Central Asian carpets, Persian glassware, and Middle Eastern spices moved east. According to Marco Polo, Mongol markets in cities like Kashgar, Samarkand, and Bokhara were vibrant centers of exchange, where merchants from multiple linguistic and cultural backgrounds conducted business in Persian, Turkic, and Chinese. Numismatic evidence. Coins minted under Mongol governors alongside imported coinage from distant regions attests to the standardized economic frameworks that facilitated such exchange. Security along the Silk Road was bolstered by Mongol military organization, which enforced laws protecting merchants and caravans. The empire's mobile cavalry could respond to raiding parties or banditry along the route, drastically reducing the risks of overland trade. Chronicles from Rashid al-Din and Plano Carpini describe how tolls, garrisons, and patrols ensured stability, demonstrating a conscious imperial strategy to integrate commerce with governance. Unlike previous empires, whose control was often concentrated in cities, the Mongols secured the steppe corridors, which had long been bottlenecks and sources of disruption for caravans. Cultural exchange under the Pax Mongolica was as significant as material trade. Buddhist texts from India traveled through Central Asia to China. Islamic scientific treatises reached Mongol courts, and European technologies, including compass navigation and medical instruments, entered Asian networks. The movement of artisans and scholars fostered hybrid cultural forms. For example, Persian miniatures influenced Chinese court painting, while Chinese printing techniques were transmitted westward. In effect, the Mongol Empire acted as a conduit for global knowledge, codifying a system in which goods, ideas, and practices could circulate with remarkable efficiency. One notable consequence of this integration was the spread of disease, most dramatically the Black Death in the mid-14th century. While unforeseen at the time, the Mongols' unification of vast regions facilitated the movement of pathogens along trade routes. Archaeological and genetic studies link the plague to caravan hubs and urban centers connected under Mongol administration, illustrating that increased connectivity carried both economic and biological implications. The Pax Mongolica demonstrates that systemic integration accelerates both human and ecological processes, a structural insight with enduring relevance. Interpretively, the Mongol period illustrates the transformative power of political unification on global exchange. By securing the steppe and regulating caravan traffic, the Mongols reduced friction along the Silk Road and enabled a level of intercontinental commerce unmatched in prior centuries. The Mongol Empire thus represents a historical inflection point. The road became not merely a conduit for luxury goods, but a mechanism for structured, predictable global interaction. By the mid-13th century, the Silk Road under Mongol control had achieved its maximum span and coherence, linking China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe in a single functioning system. Merchants and diplomats could traverse the continents with relative security. Artisans, scholars, and texts circulated alongside silks, spices, and precious metals. The era exemplifies how imperial authority, infrastructure, and intercultural tolerance combined to produce one of history's most integrated and resilient trade networks. Under Mongol order, East and West met as never before, in goods, ideas, and disease, setting the stage for the diffusion of new technologies, religious movements, and economic patterns that would continue even after the empire's eventual fragmentation. From the caravans of Central Asia came not only silk, but silence. The early 14th century brought both unprecedented prosperity and unprecedented peril along the Silk Road. While the Mongol unification of Eurasia had maximized the efficiency of trade, it also created conditions for rapid transmission of epidemic disease, illustrating the unintended consequences of global connectivity. The Black Death, 1346 to 1353 CE, a bacterium carried by fleas on rodents, spread with remarkable speed along the established trade corridors, reaching Central Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and even North Africa. The disease's trajectory demonstrates how the very networks that enabled commerce and cultural exchange could also transmit catastrophic biological impacts. Historical accounts trace the plague's westward movement through Mongol-controlled cities and caravan hubs. Marco Polo's and Ibn Battuta's earlier records of vibrant trade cities such as Kashgar, Samarkand, and Bokhara provide context for the dense urban and commercial environments in which the disease could spread. Geniza documents from Cairo and chronicles from Genoese trading colonies in the Crimea, including Kaffa, describe sudden outbreaks coinciding with merchant arrivals from the east. Archaeological analysis of mass graves along these routes confirms simultaneous high mortality events, correlating closely with the movement of merchants and goods. The role of Genoese and Venetian trade networks in the plague's dissemination is particularly notable. By the 14th century, Italian maritime republics had established port enclaves in the Black Sea, including Kaffa, Soldaya, and Tanna, functioning as gateways between overland and maritime commerce. According to chroniclers such as Gabriel de Musis, fleeing ships carried infected individuals and rats, introducing the bacterium to Mediterranean cities such as Messina in 1347. These ports had previously served as nodes for silk, spices, and precious metals. They now became vectors for one of history's deadliest pandemics. Within Central Asia, the disease exacerbated existing vulnerabilities. Mongol urban centers, including Karakoram and the administrative hubs of the Yuan dynasty in China, had grown increasingly populous due to trade and imperial consolidation. Excavations in urban cemeteries revealed densely packed burials dating to the mid-14th century, consistent with historical accounts of widespread mortality. The plague's rapid diffusion demonstrated that even robust political structures, such as the Mongol administrative apparatus, could not contain a pathogen once introduced. This epidemiological crisis had profound economic implications. Caravans across the Gansu corridor and the western steppes slowed or ceased altogether as depopulation reduced both labor and demand. Merchants, fearing contagion, avoided traditional trading hubs, shifting the flow of goods to alternative routes, including safer maritime passages. Coin hoards buried in Samarkand, Kashgar, and Merv indicate abrupt disruptions in circulation, while texts from Cairo and Damascus describe scarcity of imported silks, spices, and precious metals. In effect, the Black Death exposed the structural fragility of overland globalization. The very efficiency that allowed goods and ideas to travel quickly also permitted disease to traverse the same pathways. Culturally, the plague influenced patterns of migration, urbanization, and religious practice. Sufi shrines and Buddhist monasteries along the Silk Road saw decreased visitation, while new devotional movements emerged in response to widespread mortality. Literary sources from Persia, Central Asia, and China document changes in population distribution and social behavior, illustrating the deep societal impacts of biological exchange mediated by commerce. These shifts underscore that the Silk Road was not only an economic conduit but also a medium through which demographic and cultural transformations could be transmitted. The crisis also accelerated the shift toward maritime trade. With overland routes destabilized by depopulation, political fragmentation, and the logistical challenges of disease, maritime networks linking China, Southeast Asia, India, and the Middle East gained primacy. Ports such as Chuanzhou, Calicut, and Hormuz increasingly handled the circulation of silks, spices, and luxury goods that had once traveled predominantly overland. Contemporary records from Chinese port administrations and Arab geographers highlight the growing scale and reliability of these routes, demonstrating how traders adapted to environmental and epidemiological constraints. From an interpretive perspective, the Black Death illustrates the limits of connectivity in pre-modern globalization. While empires like the Mongol and Abbasid had created conditions for unprecedented circulation of commodities, information, and technologies, these same conditions made societies vulnerable to systemic shocks. The Silk Road's integrated network functioned as both a conduit for prosperity and a channel for disaster, highlighting the complex interplay between political unification, economic efficiency, and biological risk. Despite the demographic catastrophe, the Silk Road's underlying structural and cultural systems persisted. Even as Mongol authority receded after the mid-14th century, merchant networks, caravan infrastructure, and intercultural knowledge continued to circulate. Evidence from later 14th century trade documents shows Sogdian, Persian, and Central Asian merchants adapting routes, consolidating resources, and reconnecting markets. While the overland road lost some of its centrality relative to maritime paths, it remained a vital corridor for high-value goods, particularly textiles, spices, and precious metals. In addition to goods, the plague period demonstrates the continued movement of technology and ideas. The circulation of medical knowledge, quarantine practices, and urban planning adjustments traveled along the same networks as commerce. For instance, texts on hygiene, quarantine, and herbal remedies appear in both Persian and Chinese manuscripts from the late 14th century, reflecting a shared response to epidemic risk. The Silk Road, therefore, functioned not only as an economic artery, but as a vector for adaptive knowledge, illustrating the multidimensional consequences of global exchange. By the end of the 14th century, the Silk Road had undergone a structural recalibration. The Mongol Pax had disintegrated, political authority in Central Asia had fractured, and the demographic landscape had been irrevocably altered by plague. Yet, the resilience of local urban centers, combined with the continuity of merchant networks, ensured that the overland road remained operational, albeit under new geopolitical and epidemiological realities. The interplay of commerce, disease, and adaptation during this period underscores both the Silk Road's historical significance and the constraints inherent in pre-modern global systems. As the Mongol Empire fractured and overland routes became less secure, maritime corridors emerged as the dominant channels of intercontinental trade, setting the stage for the next phase of Silk Road history, the gradual eclipse of the land routes by oceanic exchange. As deserts grew perilous, sails replaced caravans. By the 14th century, shifts in political stability, epidemic disruption, and evolving economic patterns had begun to favor maritime trade over the traditional overland Silk Road. The Indian Ocean emerged as a primary arena for intercontinental exchange, connecting China, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. Coastal polities and port cities developed infrastructure, navigation expertise, and commercial networks capable of sustaining high-volume, long-distance trade. These maritime pathways complemented, and in some cases supplanted, the overland routes that had dominated Eurasian commerce for centuries. Southeast Asian states, particularly Srivijaya, 7th to 13th centuries, leveraged strategic positions along the Malacca Strait and Sumatra to control sea lanes linking China and India. Archaeological excavations in Palembang and Jambi reveal warehouses and dockside installations indicating large-scale storage and redistribution of goods, such as spices, precious woods, and textiles. Srivijaya merchants acted as intermediaries between Chinese exporters and Indian traders, integrating local knowledge of tides, monsoon winds, and navigation into the broader maritime system. Chinese texts, including Song dynasty accounts, praise Srivijaya's ports for their efficiency, safety, and cosmopolitan character. The Indian subcontinent also became central to maritime commerce. Ports such as Calicut, Cochin, and Surat flourished under local rulers who maintained trade monopolies on spices, cotton, and gemstones. Accounts from the Zhang He voyages, early 15th century, and Arab geographers document Chinese junks arriving with silk and porcelain, while ships from Gujarat and Malabar carried pepper, cardamom, and indigo. Archaeological finds, including Ming-era ceramics and Chinese coins along the Malabar coast, demonstrate sustained Sino-Indian trade facilitated by monsoon-driven navigation schedules. Chinese maritime technology evolved in tandem with economic demand. The Ming dynasty, 1368 to 1644, invested heavily in the construction of ocean-going junks capable of carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. Zhang He's 7 voyages, 1405 to 1433, exemplify state-supported maritime enterprise, linking the Yangtze Delta, the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, and as far as the Swahili coast. These expeditions combine trade, diplomacy, and the projection of imperial power, reinforcing China's presence in maritime networks even as overland Silk Road routes declined in relative importance. Chinese records meticulously note gifts, goods exchanged, and tributary relationships, reflecting the integration of commerce and diplomacy along the oceans. Arab and Persian merchants remained crucial intermediaries in the Indian Ocean system. Ports such as Hormuz, Muscat, and Aden functioned as redistribution hubs for goods moving between the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and Indian Ocean. Written sources, including Al-Makrisi's economic accounts, describe sophisticated financial instruments, such as hawala transfers, that mirrored overland mechanisms in facilitating long-distance trade. Maritime trade also allowed the continuation of Silk Road commodities, silks, precious stones, and spices, to reach Europe efficiently, bypassing the fragmented Central Asian corridors. Cultural exchange paralleled the circulation of goods. Merchants, sailors, and diplomats carried not only material commodities but also knowledge, religious practices, and artistic styles. Buddhist, Hindu, and Islamic networks were transmitted along these routes, as were innovations in shipbuilding, cartography, and navigational instruments. Archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, coins, and imported ceramics, indicates that port cities became cosmopolitan centers, fostering multilingual and multi-religious communities analogous to overland Silk Road hubs. The Indian Ocean trade system exemplified adaptation and resilience in response to challenges posed by disease, political instability, and the decline of Mongol authority. By capitalizing on predictable monsoon winds, advanced shipbuilding, and institutionalized port management, maritime networks enabled the continued flow of high-value goods such as silk, porcelain, and spices. These exchanges were less vulnerable to the disruptions that had devastated overland corridors during the 14th century plague, highlighting a strategic shift in global trade patterns. From an interpretive perspective, the rise of maritime Silk Road routes illustrates the dynamic relationship between geography and commerce. Oceans offered both opportunities and constraints distinct from deserts, mountains, and steppe pathways. Political patronage, navigational knowledge, and maritime infrastructure became as critical as overland security, and coastal polities that mastered these elements gained economic dominance. The Indian Ocean network thus represents a functional extension and partial replacement of the traditional Silk Road, preserving connectivity while reshaping the modalities of exchange. By the 15th century, the combination of state-supported Chinese voyages, Indian Ocean trade networks, and Persian-Arab merchant activity had created an integrated maritime corridor capable of moving vast quantities of goods over intercontinental distances. This system enabled the continuation of Silk Road trade on a global scale, even as the overland routes declined in security and economic centrality. Ports functioned as nodes not only of commerce but of cultural synthesis, reproducing the Silk Road's historical role in connecting civilizations, now through water rather than desert and steppe. By the 16th century, the age of European exploration and oceanic expansion would redraw the world map, eclipsing many traditional Silk Road routes while simultaneously integrating them into a truly global maritime economy. When Europe found its sea road to Asia, the great caravan cities began to fade. The 16th century marked the final phase of the overland Silk Road as the dominant conduit of intercontinental trade. European maritime powers, led by Portugal, established direct oceanic routes to Asia, fundamentally altering the geography of commerce. The voyage of Vasco da Gama, 1497 to 1499, around the Cape of Good Hope enabled Portuguese ships to reach the Indian subcontinent without reliance on Central Asian intermediaries. This maritime breakthrough bypassed traditional caravan networks across the steppes, deserts, and mountains that had sustained the Silk Road for more than a millennium. As a result, cities that once thrived on overland commerce, such as Samarkand, Bokhara, Kashgar, and Merv, began to experience economic contraction and relative isolation. The shift was reinforced by the rise of gunpowder empires in both the Middle East and Asia. The Ottoman Empire, 15th to 16th centuries, secured overland routes through Anatolia and the Levant, but European maritime dominance increasingly redirected trade toward coastal ports under European control. Similarly, the Safavids in Persia and the Mughals in India consolidated territorial authority, but found themselves competing with oceanic flows of silver, spices, and textiles arriving directly from East Asia and the Indian Ocean. The result was a dual marginalization. Inland caravan cities lost both economic centrality and political leverage relative to emerging coastal hubs. In China, the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, initially sponsored maritime voyages, but by the mid-15th century, imperial policy shifted toward inward consolidation. The cessation of Zhang He's expeditions and the reinforcement of the Great Wall reflected a strategic prioritization of defense and internal governance over long-distance overland trade. Simultaneously, the Qing dynasty, 17th to 18th centuries, would later assert authority over Central Asian territories, but its administrative and economic focus remained regional. While Qing policies maintained security along portions of the Silk Road, they could not reverse the long-term economic reorientation toward maritime routes and European-controlled oceanic trade. European engagement transformed commercial patterns. Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and later English merchants controlled the direct import of silk, porcelain, spices, and precious metals, undermining the traditional intermediaries in Central Asia. Genoese and Venetian networks, which had long bridged European markets with Eastern goods, now depended on maritime distribution. Archival records from Lisbon, Antwerp, and Seville indicate a rapid increase in the volume of Asian commodities arriving by ship, with price reductions in European markets further disincentivizing overland trade. Traditional caravan routes could no longer compete economically with the efficiency and scale of oceanic shipping. Central Asian cities suffered significant demographic and economic effects. Excavations at Bokhara and Samarkand reveal contraction of residential quarters and decreased evidence of imported luxury goods from the 16th century onward. Caravanserais, previously maintained as commercial infrastructure, fell into disuse or were repurposed for local traffic. However, the decline was not uniform. Some towns adapted as regional nodes, specializing in localized production or serving as administrative centers under emerging empires. Nonetheless, the overland Silk Road's function as a transcontinental conduit of wealth, goods, and culture diminished dramatically. Despite economic decline, the Silk Road's cultural and intellectual legacies persisted. Manuscripts, religious knowledge, and artistic traditions continued to circulate along both remaining overland routes and maritime networks. Persian literature, Central Asian scientific texts, and Chinese cartographic knowledge found their way to European scholars, often transported by diplomatic missions or returning merchants. These flows preserved the Silk Road's role as a medium of cross-cultural exchange, even as its material economy waned. The period also highlights the systemic consequences of technological and geopolitical shifts. Maritime navigation, European naval power, and colonial economies created a global trade network that rendered the overland corridor secondary. The integration of silver from the Americas into Asian markets, the control of strategic choke points like Hormuz, Malacca, and Goa, and the enforcement of naval monopolies exemplified how new modes of trade could restructure centuries-old continental systems. In effect, the Silk Road became increasingly a symbolic and regional network rather than the primary route for intercontinental commerce. Interpretively, the European maritime expansion illustrates the dynamic interplay between technology, empire, and economic geography. The overland Silk Road had succeeded through environmental adaptation, imperial patronage, and merchant networks. Its decline underscores that these advantages were contingent on relative geographic and political conditions. Maritime innovations, coupled with the aggressive expansion of European empires, shifted the balance of global connectivity, demonstrating that even robust, millennia-old systems could be displaced by new logistical paradigms. By the late 16th century, the Silk Road's overland arteries remained in operation, but they served a diminished role. Caravan trade persisted regionally, moving commodities such as wool, horses, and local textiles, yet high-value luxury goods increasingly traveled by sea. Central Asian cities retained cultural significance, preserving Persianate scholarship, Islamic learning, and artistic production. But the era of Eurasia-spanning overland trade had effectively ended. Yet, while the material centrality of the Silk Road waned, the legacy of interconnectivity, cultural exchange, and institutional knowledge endured, providing a foundation for modern global trade and the continuing circulation of ideas across Eurasia and beyond. Buried beneath the sands lay the archives of the world's first globalization. The 19th and early 20th centuries witnessed a renewed European interest in the Silk Road, driven by a combination of imperial ambition, scholarly curiosity, and the promise of lost civilizations. Expeditions across Central Asia, particularly in the deserts of the Darim Basin, aimed to locate and document the material remnants of trade routes that had flourished for over a millennium. These explorations transformed the Silk Road from a historical abstraction into a tangible, archaeologically verifiable system. Scholars and adventurers, often backed by national academies or colonial governments, systematically uncovered manuscripts, artifacts, and urban ruins that revealed the complexity of transcontinental exchange. Among the most prominent figures was Sven Hedin, 1865 to 1952, the Swedish geographer and explorer who undertook multiple expeditions to Central Asia. Hedin mapped extensive stretches of the Taklamakan Desert, identifying abandoned cities, fortifications, and irrigation systems. His work emphasized the logistical sophistication of the Silk Road and documented the interaction between human settlements and environmental constraints. Hedin's meticulous surveys of routes connecting Turfan, Khotan, and Lop nor provided the first modern understanding of how desert oases functioned as critical nodes in long-distance trade networks. Contemporaneously, British explorer Aurel Stein, 1862 to 1943, conducted archaeological excavations along the northern Silk Road corridors. Stein's work at Dunhuang, Naya, and Lulan yielded a remarkable corpus of manuscripts, woodblock prints, and textiles. Among his most significant discoveries were the Dunhuang manuscripts, hidden in the Mogeo caves, which included Buddhist sutras, administrative records, and commercial contracts in multiple languages, including Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit. These documents confirmed the role of monasteries as hubs of cultural preservation and trade facilitation, reinforcing historical accounts of the Silk Road as an integrated system of commerce and knowledge exchange. French sinologist Paul Pelliot, 1878 to 1945, complemented Stein's efforts by recovering additional manuscripts from Dunhuang and nearby settlements. Pelliot's focus on linguistic and textual analysis allowed scholars to reconstruct patterns of religious, commercial, and diplomatic activity across Eurasia. His work demonstrated the multilingual, multi-ethnic nature of Silk Road society, revealing interactions between Chinese, Central Asian, Persian, and Indian agents. Documents detailing taxation, trade tariffs, and contractual obligations offered concrete evidence for the regulatory and institutional structures that sustained long-distance commerce. Archaeological findings from the Lulan Kingdom provided further insight into the logistical and urban dimensions of the Silk Road. Excavations revealed city walls, residential compounds, and irrigation channels, indicating complex urban planning adapted to harsh desert environments. Artifacts such as ceramics, coins, and imported textiles illustrate the circulation of goods across vast distances, confirming historical accounts of Bactrian, Chinese, and Indian products converging in oasis towns. Inscriptions in Kharosthi and Chinese scripts reveal a literate, bureaucratically organized society that maintained trade relations over centuries. Interpretively, the work of Hedin, Stein, and Pelliot transformed historical understanding of the Silk Road. Prior to their explorations, the network was often treated as a series of isolated trade events. The recovery of manuscripts, urban remains, and artifacts reframed it as a continuous and interconnected system. These findings underscored the systematic nature of transcontinental exchange, including both commercial and cultural dimensions, and demonstrated how geography, governance, and infrastructure coalesced to sustain long-distance trade. The expeditions also highlighted the Silk Road's role in religious and intellectual transmission. Manuscripts contained evidence of Buddhist, Manichaean, Nestorian Christian, and Islamic communities operating along the same routes. This documentation showed that the Silk Road was more than a conduit for material goods. It was a channel for ideas, ritual practices, and scholarly traditions. By linking urban centers across China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, The artifacts revealed the enduring human networks that facilitated intercultural interaction for centuries. The archaeological race was not without its controversies. Competition among European powers often led to the removal of artifacts to national museums, raising modern ethical questions about cultural patrimony. Nevertheless, the collected materials have provided an invaluable foundation for contemporary Silk Road scholarship. Analyses of textiles, coins, and manuscripts using modern techniques, carbon dating, linguistic analysis, and digital mapping have refined our understanding of chronology, trade patterns, and technological dissemination along the routes. Collectively, these explorations provided systematic evidence confirming long-standing historical accounts of the Silk Road. Findings corroborated textual sources from travelers such as Faxian, Xuanzang, Marco Polo, and Ibn Battuta, while revealing previously unknown settlements, trade mechanisms, and institutional structures. The recovered material demonstrates the Silk Road's multilayered complexity, encompassing economic, political, and cultural dimensions that had evolved over more than a millennium. By the early 20th century, the Silk Road had been firmly re-established in the academic imagination as a central axis of Eurasian history. The cumulative work of explorers and archaeologists laid the groundwork for later research in economic history, comparative religion, and urban studies, demonstrating that the Silk Road's significance extended beyond commerce into broader patterns of human development. Modern scholarship would reinterpret these ruins not as isolated fragments, but as part of a continuous system of intercontinental connectivity, laying the foundation for the integrated analyses of Silk Road networks that characterize contemporary historical research. The Silk Road is no longer a map of trade, but a metaphor for human connection. In the 20th and 21st centuries, scholarly attention to the Silk Road shifted from the mere collection of artifacts to analytical interpretation, emphasizing economic systems, cultural transmission, and symbolic significance. Historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists increasingly debated the scale and intensity of Silk Road commerce, refining earlier assumptions of linear trade flows. Quantitative analyses of caravan capacity, caravanserai distribution, and commodity circulation have challenged simplistic notions of a single superhighway, revealing a complex network of routes that varied seasonally, geographically, and politically. Economic historians such as Francis Wood and Peter Frankopan have emphasized that Silk Road trade was episodic, contingent on imperial support, and heavily dependent on elite demand, demonstrating the structural vulnerabilities that persisted despite centuries of operation. At the same time, cultural studies have highlighted the hybridity fostered by Silk Road interaction. Examination of Greco-Buddhist art in Gandhara, Persian miniature painting, and Tangara cosmopolitan city planning underscores the exchange of stylistic, religious, and technological practices. Linguistic studies demonstrate multilingualism and script adaptation in trade documents, illustrating how communication systems evolved alongside commerce. The flow of ideas included religious texts, scientific knowledge, and administrative innovations, showing that the Silk Road's significance extended far beyond material goods. Scholars such as Xinru Liu have stressed that these exchanges fostered a Eurasian cultural syncretism, producing enduring artistic, religious, and intellectual traditions. Modern historiography also considers the Silk Road as a symbol in international diplomacy and heritage discourse. In the late 20th century, UNESCO launched the Silk Roads of Dialogue project, recognizing sites across China, Central Asia, Iran, and the Middle East for their historical and cultural value. These designations emphasize the route's multifaceted legacy, not merely as commercial arteries, but as spaces of intercultural negotiation, intellectual exchange, and shared human experience. Governments and institutions have used the Silk Road metaphor to promote cultural diplomacy, tourism, and global awareness of shared heritage, linking historical scholarship to contemporary international relations. Scholars have also revisited the notion of the Silk Road in light of globalization studies. Comparative analyses reveal parallels between historical trade networks and modern economic integration, highlighting recurring patterns of connectivity, vulnerability, and adaptation. The routes illustrate how geography, infrastructure, and political authority shape the movement of goods and ideas, a framework useful for understanding both historical and contemporary systems. Historians such as Valerie Hansen argue that while popular imagination often exaggerates the flow of luxury commodities, the Silk Road's enduring significance lies in its role as a conduit for knowledge, religion, and intercultural interaction, a lens through which global history can be interpreted. Textual and archaeological synthesis has refined understanding of the operational mechanisms of Silk Road trade. The examination of caravan records, contracts, and administrative texts reveals the sophistication of credit systems, taxation, and contractual enforcement. Analysis of imported ceramics, coinage, and textile fragments illustrates both trade volume and the diversity of goods exchanged, while also highlighting regional specialization. These insights underscore that the Silk Road functioned as a dynamic system, continuously adapting to environmental, political, and economic pressures, and provide empirical grounding for its symbolic and analytical use in modern scholarship. The Silk Road's cultural legacy persists in artistic, religious, and linguistic continuities across Eurasia. Buddhist, Islamic, and Christian communities maintained ritual and textual practices influenced by historical networks, while artistic motifs such as Sogdian depictions and Tang-era textiles reveal cross-cultural integration. Contemporary studies in art history, archaeology, and anthropology underscore the interconnectedness of Eurasian civilizations, illustrating how material culture served as both a practical and symbolic medium for intercultural negotiation. These perspectives reinforce the understanding that the Silk Road was not merely a conduit for wealth but a framework for sustained intellectual and social exchange. The Silk Road's symbolic use extends beyond academia into global heritage, diplomacy, and cultural identity. Modern initiatives emphasize historical inclusivity, recognizing the roles of multiple ethnic, religious, and linguistic communities along the routes. UNESCO, alongside national heritage programs, identifies cities, monasteries, caravanserais, and desert oases as critical components of a shared legacy. By framing the Silk Road as an emblem of cooperation, dialogue, and human ingenuity, contemporary discourse transforms historical analysis into a living instrument of cross-cultural understanding. Interpretively, modern scholarship illustrates the Silk Road as both system and symbol. Empirical studies reconstruct the practicalities of trade, while cultural analysis emphasizes the intangible flows of knowledge, belief, and artistic influence. Together, these perspectives reveal a network that, while materially eclipsed by maritime routes and modern transport, continues to inform contemporary understandings of globalization, connectivity, and intercultural exchange. By the early 21st century, the Silk Road had been firmly enshrined in global consciousness, not only as a historical phenomenon but as a metaphor for shared human enterprise. Its rediscovery and reinterpretation highlight enduring questions about how societies connect, adapt, and transmit knowledge across space and time. Academic debates emphasize both the historical specificity of trade networks and the universal principles of interaction they exemplify, reinforcing the Silk Road's relevance in understanding the mechanisms of global interconnection. These insights lead to a final analytical synthesis, situating the Silk Road as a continuous thread through Eurasian history, an enduring testament to the systemic, cultural, and intellectual connectivity that shaped the world long before the modern era of globalization. Across 3 millennia, the Silk Road taught the world to move, adapt, and exchange. The Silk Road represents one of the most enduring examples of pre-modern intercontinental connectivity, demonstrating the systematic integration of diverse regions through trade, culture, and political organization. Over a span of more than 3 millennia, the network linked East Asia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East, and Europe, facilitating not only the movement of commodities such as silk, spices, precious metals, and ceramics, but also the circulation of ideas, religions, technologies, and institutional practices. This continuity highlights the Silk Road's role as a proto-global system, functioning as an early model for what modern scholars identify as globalization. Interdependent regions exchanging both material and intangible assets across vast distances. From a systems perspective, the Silk Road illustrates the interdependence of geography, political authority, and economic infrastructure. Desert oases, river valleys, and mountain passes acted as nodes that concentrated trade and stabilized long-distance exchange. Empires such as the Han, Kushan, Tang, Abbasid, and Mongol maintained political oversight, provided security, and facilitated standardization of weights, measures, and currencies, which were critical for maintaining systemic flow. Archaeological and textual evidence, including caravan records, coin hoards, and administrative documents, demonstrates that each region specialized in particular commodities or skills, creating a division of labor that sustained the network's efficiency. The Silk Road's resilience and adaptability are central to its historical significance. The network survived multiple crises, including environmental challenges, nomadic incursions, political fragmentation, and pandemics. For instance, the Mongol Empire in the 13th century institutionalized the Pax Mongolica, providing safety for merchants, couriers, and pilgrims across Eurasia, while the Black Death in the 14th century revealed the vulnerability of these integrated systems. Subsequent shifts to maritime trade in the 15th and 16th centuries demonstrate the ability of global exchange networks to adapt to technological, political, and epidemiological transformations. This adaptability underscores a key feature of proto-global systems. They persist not through static infrastructure, but through dynamic interregional negotiation and continuous reorganization. Economically, the Silk Road exemplifies multiscalar exchange mechanisms, from high-volume bulk goods to luxury commodities and intellectual property. Caravanserais, port cities, and trading hubs acted as mediators of circulation, facilitating credit, taxation, and contractual enforcement. Monetary and textual records from Persia, China, and Central Asia reveal sophisticated trade practices, including hawala-based transfers and promissory notes, which minimized risk and enabled long-distance commerce. These mechanisms illustrate that the Silk Road operated as a complex economic ecosystem, integrating formal imperial structures with informal merchant networks, a model echoed in later global trade systems. The Silk Road also functioned as a vector of cultural and intellectual diffusion, reinforcing its systemic significance. Religious, linguistic, and artistic exchanges were integral to the network, as evidenced by the transmission of Buddhism to China, Greco-Buddhist art in Gandhara, Islamic scholarship in Central Asia, and manuscript circulation from Dunhuang. Translation centers in Chang'an and Samarkand, along with Buddhist monasteries and Sufi lodges, facilitated the standardized dissemination of ideas, creating a persistent cultural infrastructure. This interplay between material and intellectual exchange highlights the Silk Road as a multidimensional system, combining economic, social, and epistemic flows into a cohesive historical framework. From a world systems perspective, the Silk Road provides a model of corporate-free interaction. Major empires functioned as centers of production and regulation, while smaller oasis towns and peripheral regions specialized in intermediary or niche activities. Central Asian intermediaries, such as the Sogdians and later Turkic merchants, exemplify how peripheral actors mediated connections between cores, generating wealth and maintaining network cohesion. This multi-layered structure demonstrates the distributed agency within the Silk Road, where the system's stability depended not only on empires but also on intermediary networks, commercial protocols, and localized expertise. Interpretively, the Silk Road challenges linear conceptions of historical progress by emphasizing reciprocal influence and cross-cultural adaptation. Goods were not simply transported from one point to another. They were adapted to local markets, artistic styles evolved through exposure to multiple traditions, and technologies were modified to suit regional conditions. This feedback loop illustrates that the Silk Road was not merely a conduit but a transformative system in which movement, innovation, and adaptation were mutually reinforcing. Modern scholars, drawing on historical sociology, archaeology, and comparative economics, view this dynamic as a key feature distinguishing the Silk Road from simpler networks of regional trade. Furthermore, the Silk Road demonstrates temporal layering of exchange networks. Over its 3 millennia history, multiple iterations, Bronze Age proto-routes, Han and Kushan expansions, Tang cosmopolitan corridors, Islamic caravan networks, and Mongol stabilization, created cumulative structures that persisted even as specific routes waxed and waned. Archaeological stratigraphy, numismatic evidence, and manuscript codices document this continuity, showing that the system retained functional coherence despite fluctuations in political authority, demographic density, or environmental conditions. This historical layering provides a framework for understanding the continuity of global connectivity prior to maritime-dominated trade. Finally, the Silk Road's analytical value extends to modern conceptualizations of globalization. Its historical record demonstrates how interconnected economies, multicultural populations, and transregional communication networks emerge and evolve over long durations. By examining the interplay of geography, state structures, trade mechanisms, and cultural exchange, historians and social scientists gain insight into the systemic principles underlying global interdependence. In this sense, the Silk Road functions both as a historical case study and as a theoretical model for understanding contemporary patterns of global integration. This systems-based analysis sets the stage for the concluding assessment of the Silk Road's cultural, political, and intellectual legacy, situating its influence not only in historical terms but as a continuing framework for understanding human connectivity across Eurasia and the broader world. Today, steel and fiber optic cables follow the same paths once walked by caravans. In the 21st century, the Silk Road has reemerged as both a symbolic and practical framework for global connectivity. Governments, international organizations, and corporations reference its historical precedent to promote economic, cultural, and diplomatic initiatives. The most prominent example is China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013, which seeks to create a network of transportation infrastructure, trade corridors, and investment projects spanning Eurasia and beyond. While technologically and politically distinct from the historical Silk Road, the BRI deliberately invokes the metaphor of centuries of intercontinental exchange to legitimize contemporary globalization strategies. Contemporary scholarship contextualizes these projects within the longue durée of Silk Road connectivity, highlighting structural parallels between past and present. Ancient caravan routes linked urban hubs, resource-rich regions, and political centers. Modern infrastructure similarly seeks to integrate transportation nodes, energy corridors, and digital networks. Analysts note that while the modalities differ, roads, railways, ports, and fiber optic cables replacing camel caravans and junks, the underlying principle of facilitating interregional flow of goods, ideas, and services persists. Studies in economic geography emphasize that modern Eurasian integration mirrors historical patterns, where political sponsorship, logistical innovation, and cultural negotiation remain essential for maintaining systemic connectivity. Cultural diplomacy also draws on Silk Road heritage. UNESCO's Silk Roads, Roads of Dialogue initiative continues to highlight sites across Eurasia, promoting shared heritage, intercultural dialogue, and tourism development. Cities such as Xi'an, Samarkand, Bokhara, and Kashgar are celebrated not only for historical trade activity but as symbols of cross-cultural exchange. Exhibitions, academic conferences, and international collaborations reinterpret Silk Road artifacts and texts to foster a sense of global historical consciousness, reinforcing the idea that contemporary connectivity is rooted in historical precedents. Modern historical narratives frequently emphasize the intangible dimensions of the Silk Road: knowledge, technology, and cultural hybridity. Digital humanities projects, including GIS mapping of ancient routes and database-driven analyses of manuscripts and artifacts, allow scholars to quantify connectivity and simulate historical trade flows. These approaches demonstrate continuity in information networks, showing that just as caravans carried goods and ideas across deserts and mountains, contemporary supply chains, data routes, and communication systems transmit material and cultural capital across continents. The Silk Road also functions as a metaphor for diplomacy and international cooperation. Governments invoke its legacy to legitimize cross-border infrastructure projects, cultural exchanges, and multilateral agreements. For example, scholarly conferences, bilateral heritage projects, and museum collaborations often frame modern Eurasian engagement as a renewal of Silk Road connectivity, emphasizing shared historical experience over national or regional distinction. In this sense, the Silk Road has transcended its economic origins, operating as a conceptual model for global interdependence. Interpretively, the modern revival of the Silk Road highlights the enduring interplay between history and policy. Historical networks inform contemporary strategic planning, just as modern geopolitical and technological capacities reshape the interpretation of past exchange systems. Scholars emphasize that while the contexts differ, maritime and overland trade of the past versus railways, highways, and digital networks today, the principles of infrastructure, security, and intermediary facilitation remain remarkably consistent. This perspective underscores a long-term continuity of connectivity logic, bridging ancient and modern frameworks. The Silk Road's symbolic and practical uses also illuminate global perceptions of Eurasian interconnectivity. By framing contemporary projects in historical terms, policymakers and academics reinforce the notion that regional cooperation, resource allocation, and cultural exchange are historically validated mechanisms for sustaining interdependence. Archaeological and textual evidence from Dunhuang, Samarkand, and Chang'an provides empirical grounding for these narratives, demonstrating that past trade systems were not random or incidental, but structured and institutionally supported networks capable of sustaining prolonged exchange across vast geographies. Modern economic and cultural infrastructure projects inspired by the Silk Road further reveal the adaptability of historical memory. Urban planning, tourism, and logistics initiatives often invoke Silk Road motifs to promote regional identity and investment, blending heritage with contemporary functionality. Digital platforms visualize historical trade corridors alongside modern transportation networks, reinforcing the idea that connectivity is both spatial and conceptual, linking human movement, information flow, and cultural interaction over time. Finally, the Silk Road's relevance in contemporary globalization demonstrates that historical trade networks can inform present and future policy. Its enduring lessons about the importance of intermediaries, safe corridors, urban nodes, and adaptable institutions offer insight into how regions can maintain systemic resilience amid environmental, political, or technological disruption. Moreover, the Silk Road's history emphasizes that connectivity is not merely economic but also social, intellectual, and cultural, providing a multidimensional model for understanding contemporary interdependence. By tracing the Silk Road from Neolithic proto-routes to modern policy frameworks, it becomes clear that these networks were not merely historical artifacts but living templates for human interaction. They exemplify the persistence of systemic principles across millennia, highlighting how geography, infrastructure, governance, and culture collectively facilitate sustained exchange. Today's steel highways, rail links, and fiber optic cables follow patterns once charted by caravans, illustrating the enduring logic of connectivity in shaping human societies. This completes the documentary's chronological and analytical arc, from prehistoric trade corridors to the modern world system, demonstrating the Silk Road's continuity as both a material and conceptual network, a legacy of connection that continues to inform commerce, culture, and policy across Eurasia and the globe. If you found this journey through the Silk Road illuminating, consider subscribing to Nightfall History for more deep dive, academically grounded explorations of civilizations, empires, and the networks that shaped our world. Hit the bell icon to be notified of new videos that trace history with precision, evidence, and calm, cinematic storytelling. For those who want to explore further, check the video description for sources, timelines, and reading recommendations to deepen your understanding of the Silk Road and its enduring legacy. Settle in and continue discovering the pathways that connected humanity across millennia.